Hello again, and welcome back to Academic Writing 101. Today we will begin our lecture series with Section 1, entitled The Writing Process. So I hate to break it to you, but successful academic writing is a process. So say goodbye to those days of waiting until the day before the deadline to write your papers, hoping that you'll get a good grade. Sure, some students can still pull that off from time to time, even in college. I remember doing that once or twice as an undergraduate and receiving grades I didn't really deserve, but the majority of students can never get away with it consistently. Believe me, I have seen many who continue to try despite my warnings not to. Besides, by not pushing yourself through the writing process, you rob yourself of the critical exploration great academic writing invites and is supposed to encourage. But okay, I'll climb down from my soapbox for just a second and give you the essential ideas of the writing process. So for successful college writing, the writing process includes 4 steps. That is to pre-write, to outline, to draft, and finally to revise. Often when I introduce this process to my students, they complain that they don't have the time. But I promise you, if you follow this simple 4-step process with each of your future writing assignments, no matter how short or long they might be, your writing will improve, and you'll realize that it will begin to take you less time to write, and to write well, as you work through this process, than if you decide not to. So throughout the next few lectures, we'll talk about each part of the writing process in detail, with tips and strategies and all the essentials that you need to do each part well, but for today we'll only focus on the first. So let's talk about pre-writing. What do I mean when I say the word pre-write? Pre-writing is simply the process of exploring your immediate ideas in response to any given topic or assignment. It is an exercise to force yourself to begin exploring how your ideas connect to one another. Pre-writing, in other words, is simply a fancy word for brainstorming. Everyone has their own way or technique of brainstorming, so I'd like to introduce you today to 2 effective brainstorming techniques when it comes to writing. The first is simply to free write. So free writing is a process where we write down whatever comes to mind in response to the given assignment, with no regard to form, grammar, punctuation, and so on. Just write. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it really is an effective way of forcing our mind to process the assignment and to explore what our automatic responses are. The other is to come up with an idea map. Some people also call this a mind map. You've probably done this all the way back through high school. But an idea map or a mind map is more of a drawing rather than writing. So it's simply an illustration of your ideas, showing how to group and connect your individual ideas. Let me give you an example of each so you can see what I'm talking about. So if we have the assignment, like the one here on the board, write a 2 to 3 page critical response to the following statement. A mandatory national curriculum is the best way to prepare students for college. So to free write, if we were to free write, here's an example. These are my immediate thoughts or ideas in response to this assignment prompt. No, it's not. Not every student is the same. Not every student has the same interests or goals or reasons for going to school. A mandatory national curriculum stunts the potential growth of some while not addressing the learning difficulties of others. This is a terrible idea. So again, these are simply some of my immediate responses to the assignment. So it's nothing fancy, it's nothing overly profound. It is simply to get my mind working through the process of responding to this question or to this statement. As we work through the steps of the writing process, I'll return to this free writing exercise to show you where we go from there. So of course this might seem a little bit pointless to write down our immediate response thinking, oh, we have it all in our head already. But again, as we work through the next few mini lectures in this section, I'll return to this free writing exercise to show you how this is an effective tool to begin to construct our writing assignments. The next one, of course, is the idea map. Again, in response to the same assignment, an idea map would start with the topic, which is a national curriculum. We then make our drawings simply with arrows, nothing fancy, to the different things or different ideas, the different categories of ideas that come to our mind automatically. So one of the questions that comes to my mind in response to a national curriculum is, what is taught? Another one would be types of students, so addressing the different types of students. The final one would be arguments for. It's always great to have that as a category to show that you've processed or at least considered some of the arguments that will go against your own argument. And then beneath each category, we simply list a couple of ideas or subtopics. For example, under what is taught, focus on math and science determined by the majority. So again, these are just my initial rough draft ideas of how I respond to a national curriculum and what is taught. The next would be types of students. So here I've simply listed a couple of different types of students. I encounter these types of students in the classroom every day. We have hands-on students, students that are just disinterested, or students that are really wanting to excel and do everything they can to learn every possible thing they can about any given subject. Finally, we have arguments for. Number one, maybe it ensures that all students reach a certain standard level of academic achievement. It provides every student with the same opportunity to learn and to go to school. And it's also easy to monitor, so we can do our standardized testing and make sure that everyone can pass the standardized test. Again, this is just an example of my own immediate response to the assignment that is given. And I'm forcing myself to put these ideas onto paper, forcing myself to think through how I would respond and what my responses might be, and then to put them on paper. Just like the free writing, as we work through the writing process, the different steps of the writing process will return to this idea map to show how it is useful to craft the rest of your paper. So let's review really quickly to conclude for today. Pre-write is simply brainstorming on paper. So getting those ideas out of your head and onto paper. We have the two techniques. We have free writing and making an idea map. And that's it. That's the first step of the writing process. Next time we'll talk about outlining, the second step of the writing process, and we'll carry on our ideas from free writing and idea mapping onto the outline to show how this is an ongoing process, how each step relates to the next. So thank you for today, and we'll see you again soon. We're back. Today we'll be discussing step 2 of the writing process, which is outlining. In section 2, later on in our lecture series, we'll discuss in more detail how to organize your writing effectively, including how to write a strong thesis, how to write coherent paragraphs, and so on. For now, however, I'd like to briefly introduce you to the practice of outlining and show you the beginning stages of developing a thesis statement and your supporting paragraphs. So why do we outline? An outline is your plan or your blueprint to constructing a strong paper. Imagine building a house, for example, without a blueprint. I think that goes there. No, wait, the kitchen is supposed to go on the other side of the house. It would never work. My father-in-law, for example, is a general contractor and has built countless homes and commercial buildings over the past 30 years. But despite his confidence and experience, he begins every project, even a simple bedroom renovation, by drawing up a plan. I do the same when I write. So here are some reasons why we outline. First, it saves time in the long run. It really does. Students never believe me on this, but it really does. A quick outline saves so much time in the long run. It forces you to organize your ideas early on into a logical structure. It keeps you centered on your original thesis. It reminds you quickly what you wanted to say next, or what you were going to say next, if you have to ever stop while you're writing. It keeps your mind from going blank or getting sidetracked while you're writing. So altogether, there really are only 2 parts of an effective outline. The first is your thesis, which is your argument or your intervention. The second part is simply the structure of your argument. So let's talk about each of these quickly. A thesis statement is what really sets college writing apart from all types of pre-college writing. Writing a strong thesis statement is by far what first-year college writing students and what returning college students have the most trouble with. Believe me, many third and fourth year students still have never figured it out. Before college, most schools and teachers are interested in what information you are able to digest and regurgitate. In college, most professors and schools are interested in what you can critically and creatively do with the information given you. How will you react? What insights or knowledge can you add to any given subject? How can you work to create new knowledge? A thesis is your clear declaration in response to these questions. It is not a summary of what you know. It is a statement of what you are going to do with the knowledge, or how you are going to persuade me to trust your claims. So let's work back from our previous lecture and build a very basic thesis for our writing assignment. If you remember, we did a brief pre-writing assignment with an example of free writing and an idea map. Returning to what we wrote down is the best way to begin to write a good thesis. In other words, whether you did free writing, an idea map, or any other form of brainstorming, returning back to what you wrote down during that exercise, during your pre-writing exercise, is the most efficient and effective way to begin writing a good thesis. So looking back again at the assignment, and what we wrote down as our initial response to the assignment in our free writing exercise. The key word in the assignment is a critical response. So looking back at our free writing exercise, what was our response? Our response was, no, it's not. A mandatory national curriculum for students is not a good idea. Believe it or not, that is the beginning stage of your thesis. So beginning thesis would be, no, it's not! Exclamation point. We'll learn later on in section 2, in some of our lectures in section 2, about how to express this thesis more elegantly and more professionally or more academically. But for now, this is our foundation. Our critical response to the given statement in the assignment is no, it's not. And beginning with this thesis is the best way to start an effective outline. The second is then to separate and organize your ideas into groups. So again, let's return to our other pre-writing exercise, this time to our idea map, to remember what our initial ideas were and how we began to group them already. We can always build from our pre-writing exercises. If we look back at our idea map, we see that we already have grouped our ideas under a few specific headings. So let's use those headings as the sections, the preliminary sections of our outline to support our thesis. So if we go back, we have our three headings or three categories: what is taught, types of students, and arguments for. We also already have a few ideas under each heading. These could be the beginnings of our paragraphs. Now we just have to choose which order we think best supports our response and then begin to build our outline. We always begin our outline with our thesis statement. After all, the outline is simply a map of how we are going to best support our thesis. Then we list our section headings and subheadings in the order we think best supports our argument. For a response style paper, especially such a short one, remember the assignment was only 2 to 3 pages, I think it is wise to begin with the counter arguments, since our goal is to persuade our readers to disagree with the arguments that are in favor of a national curriculum. So our first section heading is arguments for. Then go ahead and list your subheadings directly from our idea map. So we have, it ensures that all students reach a certain standard level, provides every student with the same opportunity, and is easy to monitor. Now do this for each of your headings and subheadings. So we have types of students with our subheadings, what gets taught with our subheadings. And there you have it. That is our basic outline. We'll revise it or learn to revise our outline a bit in the next lecture as we discuss the next step in the writing process, which is drafting. But for now, that's how we move from pre-writing to the outlining stages in the writing process. Pre-write is our immediate response, put down all of our ideas on paper in response to the assignment, and outline is how we begin to organize that response after we've found what our initial foundational thesis statement is. Again, we do not have to develop an elegant, perfectly crafted thesis statement to begin outlining. Rather, we identify what our claim is, and then we begin to organize it from there. So we'll see you next time as we talk about drafting, and we continue to revise this outline into a solid. Welcome back, everyone. Moving along today with the writing process. We've talked already about pre-writing and outlining, how to form just a basic thesis statement. And today, we're going to go ahead and move on to our third step in the writing process. So again, we have pre-writing, outlining. Today, we're talking about drafting. When we talk about drafting, it simply means that writing the first draft of any assignment, any paper, when you put all those ideas into paragraph form. So my main goal of today is to simply walk us through the basic parts of any paper. Okay? So the parts of a paper are the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. So the first part of drafting is to turn back to your outline that you've already produced with your original thesis statement, and then to revise that outline into the basic parts of the paper. So we have the introduction. Here we'll talk about the arguments for, ensures that all students reach a certain standard level, provides every student with the same opportunity, is easy to monitor, and then we end with our thesis, no to a national curriculum. And then let's fill in our body. So we have types of students, hands-on, disinterested, wanting to excel, what gets taught, focus on math and science, determined by the majority, and then the conclusion. So if you look at this revised outline, what we have now is a list of every paragraph we're going to write for this short paper. So we have the introduction. That's all going to be 1, maybe 2 paragraphs, right? Depending on the size of your paper, you can have longer or shorter introductions. But let's assume for this assignment that it's going to be 1, maybe 2 paragraphs. It concludes with your thesis. Of course, by this time, you will have revised and refined your thesis. Then we look at our body, and we have 2 main headings and 3 subheadings, right? So let's imagine that those are each paragraphs. So an introductory type paragraph of the types of students, a paragraph with hands-on students, giving examples of that, a paragraph with disinterested students, again, examples of that, a paragraph of wanting to excel, students who want to excel, again, providing examples and discussion of that. And then we get on to our next main point, our main argument against a national curriculum, being what gets taught. So another paragraph of what gets taught, and then 2 sub-paragraphs, we'll say, one on focus on math and science, and one on determined by the majority. And then we move on to the conclusion. And I'm going to talk in length about how to form a good introduction, how to form a nice thesis statement, how to develop solid, coherent body paragraphs, and also how to construct a conclusion. You can look through the lectures and see that's in our next section. But for now, I simply want us to recognize how to organize our ideas and to begin writing, right? So drafting is writing. And my suggestion is before you start to write, to revise that outline into the exact organization, into the parts of the paper. And then you can always look back to that as you actually write out your ideas, your analysis, your examples, your discussion into a paragraph form. But again, next section is all about the actual parts of a paper and how to develop those parts successfully. So that's it today for drafting. We'll see you again soon on our discussion of revising. Alright, welcome back everyone to our final lecture in the first section. I'm happy that you've stuck with me so far. I realize that this first part may seem quite elementary to some of you, but I know that it is a critical part to understand the actual writing process when it comes to writing successfully at the college level. The good thing about this learning platform is that you can bounce back and forth and switch around and go to whatever lecture you think is most relevant at this specific time period or relevant to the assignment that you're about to do in school. But for this first set of lectures, this first section, I simply wanted to introduce you to the idea of the writing process and walk you through it one step at a time. So we've talked about pre-writing, outlining, drafting, and now we're on to revising. Lots of students think that revising means to do a final spell check of your paper right before turning it in. Okay, maybe you don't think that, but that's what lots of students end up doing. What I'm going to introduce you to is a more critical and a more productive way of revising that will end up giving you the best possibility to come up with a solid paper and to get the best grade that you actually deserve. Okay, so when I talk about revision as a big to small process, meaning we start with the big issues and work our way down till we finally get to your last click of spell check. So let me introduce you first to the different steps that I think are necessary in a full revision process. We have overall unity of the body paragraphs, effectiveness of each paragraph, correct use of citations, sentence style, sentence level errors, word choice, spelling, spell check, which you all love way too much, and finally to read aloud. So let me talk about each one of these steps in a little bit more detail. What I'm going to do today is to introduce some core questions you should be asking yourself at each step of the revision process. Okay? And again, depending on the amount of time you have for any given assignment and how long you've procrastinated, we need to start at the very top of this revision process with the overall unity. These are the things that professors are looking for first, and they're also the things that will simply make your paper so much stronger. So the first one is overall unity. From reading a draft of your paper, what is your main point? Does your introduction clearly state the main point of your paper? Does each paragraph stay on topic or in line with your main point? Does any paragraph digress? I might add here, if it does, cut it out immediately. Don't be afraid to cut out paragraphs, even if you worked a long time on them, if they digress from your main argument or your main point. Finally, does your conclusion show that you have reached the goal of your main point? Okay, so these are simple questions to ask yourself to test whether or not you believe that your paper is unified around a central main argument or point. One key strategy, especially for longer writing assignments, is a strategy I learned a long time ago and I've used for many years now, called reverse outlining. So reverse outlining is where you read your paper backwards. Not word for word, of course, but that you read each paragraph, starting with the last, in isolation. By doing this, it gives you the opportunity to recognize whether or not your paragraphs are addressing the main point of your paper, and whether or not they are staying on topic. So to reverse outline, what you do is you read a paragraph, and next to that paragraph you write in one simple sentence what the main topic is. If the main topic is not directly related to your main point, cut the paragraph out. If the main topic is not highlighted early on in the paragraph, then you need to revise that paragraph and highlight that main topic of the paragraph early on in the paragraph. And finally, if you notice that the paragraph introduces lots of different ideas or multiple ideas, you need to decide whether or not you want to break that up into multiple paragraphs. We'll talk all about paragraphing later on in this lecture series, but I want to introduce you to this key revision strategy early on, the strategy of reverse outlining. Please feel free to email me with any questions, and I'd love to also hear your feedback if you try this and you see that it's working for you. The next one is the unity of body paragraphs. Does each paragraph refer directly back to and work to develop your argument? Do you use clean transitions or key words to move from one paragraph to the next? We then move on to the effectiveness of each paragraph. Do you state the main point of each paragraph clearly and most often in the topic sentence, which is the first sentence of your paragraph? Do you have any paragraphs that are unusually short? If so, you need to consider whether or not you should combine that paragraph with another one that's speaking on the same topic. Or do you need to be more specific and have more clear discussion, more support of that main topic within the paragraph? Are any of your paragraphs exceptionally long? If so, are you discussing multiple points within a single paragraph? I bet you are. Should you separate the paragraph into multiple shorter paragraphs? Does each paragraph transition well from the one before to the one after? We'll talk all about transitions in a later lecture, but for the revision process, this is a question to ask yourself, whether or not you have good transitions between paragraphs. And finally, does each paragraph focus on a single main point? I will highlight this so many times when we talk about paragraphs exclusively, but each paragraph should only talk about one main point. The next is the correct use of citations. Are you quoting too much that the quotations are beginning to crowd out your own ideas? Your own ideas need to be the bulk of your paper, right? So if we're quoting or citing too many sources and too much, it's going to crowd out your own ideas, and it's going to make more of a summary of other people's ideas, which we don't want at the college level. Are any of your quotations too long? Again, do we have like a page-long quotation? If so, cut it down. Pick out the things that are most important and highlight that as the quotation, rather than the entire block. Have you correctly acknowledged each source that you have used to make sure that you avoid plagiarism? Again, we'll talk about citations later on in another lecture, but we need to make sure that we're citing our sources correctly. And now let me give you one more key strategy of citations or of quoting others' materials. It's a strategy I learned again when I was very early in my undergraduate degree, and I found it so useful. It's called the purpose of life, or the purpose of a quotation. So we ask ourselves three main questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? And where am I going? This is to highlight the need to transition into and back out of the quotations that you're using. So here I've drawn just a tiny goofy diagram, really, of ramping up into the quotation and then back into your own writing. So where did I come from? Means we need to introduce our quotation. Who is speaking? Where is the source from? Etc. Why am I here? Is the quotation, right? The actual words of the quotation. And where am I going? Ramping back down into our own writing is the transition back into our discussion. Okay, very good. And we'll talk again more about this later on. On to sentence style. Do you vary the length, structure, and shape of your sentences? Are some of your sentences unnecessarily long, complex, or difficult to understand? When you have used passive voice, have you used it appropriately? We'll talk all about passive voice later on. Again, remember, this is the introductory first section. We're only talking about the basics. You can come back to this later on as a guide. We'll talk about these things in detail later on. Sentence level. Do you have any fragment sentences? In other words, does every sentence have a subject and a verb? Have you conjugated your verbs correctly? Have you used proper punctuation? And do you have any comma splices, which are when two complete sentences are joined by nothing but a comma? A very, very common mistake. Word choice. Is your diction or your choice of words too formal, too casual, too scientific, or do you use too many jargon words? Do the words you use express your ideas concretely or abstractly? Do you use too many unnecessary words? And finally, do you really need all of those words to modify or intensify your discussion? For example, kind of, a lot, really, very, extremely, and so on. Of course, here the really in my sentence that's in italics is on purpose to highlight how often we use these type of words. We go on now to spelling versus spell check. As you all know, spell check only catches misspelled words. It does not catch things like whether or not you've used your apostrophes correctly to show possession. It usually does not catch things like correct plurals. Have you mixed up your homonyms? For example, there, and there. Spell check will not catch that for you, even if you really want it to. Have you capitalized the correct words? Again, spell check will not help you in that category. Finally, after you've checked these types of misspellings manually, you can now click on the automatic spell check and breathe a nice deep sigh of relief that you are almost done. I say almost because the last key critical step of good revision is to read your paper aloud. I prefer to read it aloud to my wife, much to my wife's dismay. No, actually, she does a great job at giving me some good feedback, and she catches things that I don't catch in my own writing. But I read it aloud, and it helps me to catch those final little mistakes, those final lacks of transitions, those final spelling or grammatical or punctuation errors. And I would suggest that you print it out. I know I'm suggesting to waste paper, but it is not a waste. It will really help. Print out your paper and read it on paper and edit it on paper for your final edit or your final revision, and then put those into the digital copy, and you're ready to print it off the final version and submit it. I promise you, if you follow this revision process, your papers will improve so much. And when you don't have enough time to go through this entire revision process, start big. Look for your unity. Look for your argument and whether or not your paragraphs address that argument specifically. Don't worry about spelling and grammar and punctuation. Those are the minor things that are often overlooked anyway by a professor. A professor is looking for your strong argument supported by strong paragraphs. Okay? So when it comes time to revise, if you're running short on time, if you've waited until the night before or the day before, take a moment, reread it for unity, reread it for the big issues at hand, and don't worry about the small stuff. The small stuff is when you have extra time, right? So we'll talk about these things in more detail in lectures to come. We're now concluding section 1 on the writing process, and it's time to get busy with the real stuff. Congratulations, you did it. You finished section 1 and we're now on to section 2, which is organizing your ideas. So welcome everyone to lecture 1 of section 2. Today's topic is titles. And today's going to be a very brief lecture, just like your title should be very brief and to the point. We're going to talk about the purposes of a title, functions, some of the possible sources of where to find or where to come up with a good title. We'll give you some examples and also some basic things to consider. Alright, so let's start. Purposes of a title. To attract the attention of your reader. Okay, a good title should draw your reader in and make them want to read your paper. A good title is also to tell your reader what your paper is about. So the purposes, both of these purposes need to be fulfilled with a good title. It's not okay to just attract your reader. And it's also not okay to only tell your reader what your paper is about. We need to do both. Title functions. The title functions are to tell the general topic, tell about the general topic. It's also to gain the interest of the reader and to set the tone. So whether it's going to be very formal and academic, or whether it's going to be more opinion or a little more casual. And possible title sources are things like a key idea or a phrase from the thesis statement. It could be a key question that you plan to address in your paper. It could be a key phrase from the paper, so actually from the body of the paper, maybe a phrase that you repeat multiple times for emphasis. It could also be a pertinent quotation from another source that you'll be taking up throughout your paper. Okay, so let's look at a few examples. Before though, let's remind ourselves of the key components. First, it needs a hook to introduce the paper creatively. Keywords to identify the topics or concepts your paper will discuss. And another really good component that students so often forget is the place or time, the where or when your exploration or your discussion is happening. So setting your discussion within its context. So here are some examples. They're just goofy ones that I came up with. Number 1, monkey business. Mapping the international monkey market in 20th century South Africa. Okay, so we have our hook, monkey business. Sounds kind of fun, kind of creative. And then we have the key concepts or topics. International monkey market. Okay, that's the key topic. And then we also have the setting, 20th century South Africa. Okay, so it's goofy, but it's a good title. Number 2, pious persecution, religious intolerance in antebellum America. So here again we have the hook, pious persecution. It's contradictory, so it catches the audience. How is persecution also pious, right? We then have the main topic, which is religious intolerance. Again, that also catches the audience. We're used to hearing the term religious tolerance, especially in America. So religious intolerance, the topic. And then the setting is antebellum America, right? So antebellum meaning the time before the American Civil War, right? So that's the setting. Our third example, putting on the pants, the shift in domestic gender roles in 1960s America. So again, we have that hook, putting on the pants. It's kind of fun, it's catchy, it hooks the audience, or it draws the audience's or your reader's attention. And then we have the topic, a shift in domestic gender roles. Okay, so the main topic, the key words are domestic gender roles. And then we have the setting, 1960s America. Okay, it's actually that simple. And you see even the highest academics using this basic formula of writing a good title. A hook, keywords, and the setting. Here are a few things to consider. First thing to consider when you're writing a title is to consider who your audience is. You'll never want to offend your audience in an attempt to be creative or to gain interest. So every once in a while an academic gets away with it, but as a general rule, no cursing, no dirty words, no strange things that are just offensive, right? Second, make sure the tone and content of your title match your audience. So if you're writing an opinion paper for a local newspaper, you could be casual, right? You can write with the common vernacular or slang of the area. If you are addressing your professor, or if you're addressing a committee of academics, your title needs to reflect that, right? You need to reflect that you understand the level of your audience and the formalities that are required for that level. Next, only use quotation marks in your title if you are quoting from a different source. So this is really basic, but you don't put quotation marks around your title. You only put quotation marks in the title if you've inserted a quotation from somewhere else as part of your title. Finally, know how to use the colon title. All of the examples I showed you before use the colon title. Again, this is a very, very standard academic college writing title formula, but it works. I use it all of the time. It's a very good way to catch the reader and then to give the description of what the paper is going to be about. But we need to know how to use that colon title. So first, before the colon is where you put the catchy creative hook, the thing that grabs your reader's attention. And after the colon is where we need to give the descriptive keywords that signal the topic and setting of your paper. And that's it. All right, welcome back. I'm very excited about today's topic because it is one of, if not the most important part of good college level writing, and that is thesis statements. So I've promised this before. Today we're going to talk in a lot more detail about thesis statements, and we're going to give you some strategies and some tips of how to formulate a good thesis. Really, this is the key, the most important part of your paper. So let's begin by talking about the purposes of a thesis. A good thesis statement fulfills two purposes. First, it clearly states the focus of your paper. And second, it provides a framework for the rest of the paper. The biggest tip I can possibly give you is to keep your thesis narrow. In other words, recognize that your paper, no matter how long your paper is, can only cover so much. In other words, you're not going to be able to write a paper on American history. Okay, that topic is way too broad to fit even within a good book or a single book. You could, however, write a very good paper about the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, so we need to keep it narrow. You could even narrow that down further to the process of writing the Emancipation Proclamation. And that even further, so you can get more and more and more narrow. And the best thesis, or the best tip I can give you right off the bat, is the more narrow, the better. Okay? So a good thesis also shows the limit of the material you plan to cover. In other words, it recognizes that there is a very large context and lots of materials that you could be covering, but you've chosen to focus or to narrow your topic down to something very specific. A specific thesis, or a narrow thesis, will set you up to write a very detailed and a very solid paper. So when we talk about thesis statements, especially at the college level, a word that you're going to hear over and over and over again is the word argument. And no, we don't mean what you get in with your parents or with your significant other. An argument is your position or your findings or your claims on a specific topic. Okay? So something that sets academic writing or college writing apart from other types of writing is that college writing is meant to add new insights to any given field or subject. So it's not about proving how much you know. It's not about summarizing what other people know. It's about adding a new insight or putting your knowledge and your collected knowledge of others into action to do something new. So what I mean by an argument is that when we write an argumentative paper, we write something that supports and explains a certain claim. Okay, so our thesis statement puts that claim out there, it announces our claim, and an argument supports and explains that claim. So let's give you some examples, some really basic examples of an argumentative thesis statement. Number 1, soccer is the world's greatest sport. Okay, why is this argumentative? Because lots of people in the world, although they don't know what they're talking about, of course, lots of people in the world claim that soccer is not the world's greatest sport. Okay, so there can be a debate. An argument or a thesis needs to invite debate. It needs to invite counter-arguments. The problem with this one, though, is although it announces the claim, it does not in any way set up the framework of your paper. Okay, so for now, this is a very, very general, very broad claim. Let's just take it one step further. Number 2, because the World Cup is the most watched sporting event in the world, soccer is the world's greatest sport. Okay, so this one's getting a little bit closer to a solid thesis. It's giving at least one example of why you claim, or why I'm claiming that soccer is the world's greatest sport. So it's announcing here the focus as the World Cup being proof of soccer's amazing reception throughout the world. But this still falls short. So let's turn to number 3, which again is not perfect by any means, but it shows you the development of a thesis. So we have, although baseball continues to gain popularity internationally, soccer remains the most played, viewed, and funded sport in the world. And here we get to talk about how to announce a claim and to set up the framework of the paper. So if you see in this third example, we still have that initial claim that soccer is the greatest sport in the world. However, we also signal to a counter-argument. So although baseball continues to gain popularity internationally, so that signals that there is a counter-argument about baseball and probably other sports as well. And it also gives us 3 categories that set up the framework of the paper. Categories being the most played, the most viewed, and the most funded sport in the world. So we have played, viewed, and funded. Again, we could revise and revise and revise to make this thesis even more narrow and even more concrete. However, this is a really good starting thesis for any college level paper. Right? We announce the counter-argument, we give our claim, and we set up the framework by providing categories, played, viewed, funded, that we will go ahead and address throughout the body of our paper. So let's dig a little bit deeper. How do we create an argumentative thesis? So we're going to do the same thing that we just did with our soccer argument by returning to our initial assignment. Remember our assignment? A critical response to the mandatory national curriculum statement. So if you go back to our very, very beginning, we had, no, it's not. Not every student is the same. Not every student has the same interests or goals or reasons for going to school. A mandatory national curriculum stunts the potential growth of some while not addressing the learning difficulties of others. This is a terrible idea. So remember we said our very basic thesis that we took out of our pre-writing exercise was, no, it's not, or this is a terrible idea. Those are our thesis statements on the very fundamental level. So let's revise that a little bit. Our first revision could be, a mandatory national curriculum is a bad idea because it keeps all students at the same level. Okay, so here again we have our claim. A mandatory national curriculum is a bad idea. And we have our reasoning, because it keeps all students at the same level. So this fulfills to some degree the purposes of a thesis. It announces the claim and it supports that claim, but we're still not setting up the framework for our paper. So let's do another revision, remembering that we need to announce the claim and set up the framework of the paper in a concise way. So our final revision reads, although a mandatory national curriculum has proven to increase national test score averages, it has proven unable to address the needs, awaken interest, and invite innovation in the nation's individual students. So, like our previous soccer argument, here I began with although, and we'll talk about this in a minute, these key thesis type of words. But I start with the counter argument. One of the really big counter arguments could be that national test score averages are rising ever since a national curriculum has been put in place. However, the framework of our paper gives some of the categories that we're going to talk about to support our claim that this is not a good idea. So we have it as proven unable to address the needs. So that's category number 1, unable to address the needs. Awaken interest, category number 2. And invite innovation, category number 3, in the nation's individual students. Okay, so this is a much more subtle way of saying, no, it's not, in a very academic way that announces our claim while also providing the framework for our paper. And again, here we don't have to be so detailed and talk about every little evidence we're going to give. Instead, we announce categories that our evidence will fit into that will address our claim or support our claim. Let me give you a key strategy then, like I just promised. Key terms for thesis writing. A key strategy, and believe me, professors will never think this is too repetitive. It's the although actually construction. Okay? So what I mean, and you've seen this in the 2 examples we've done so far. An easy, effective way to make sure your thesis is stating an argument is to begin with although, because although means we're going to put forth a counter argument that our claim will then work against, right? So, although somebody or many people say one thing, there's actually a lot of evidence that proves a new claim, perspective, and so on. Again, it's a basic strategy of thesis writing, but one that if you will adopt, will really set up your argument clearly and will lead to a nicely written paper. Although, state the counterargument, actually, and then you provide the categories of your claim, right? The categories that you'll use to support your claim. And no, you don't actually need to write actually. As you saw in my examples before, I never used the word actually. I simply stated those categories and the claim. Okay, so we could talk for hours and hours about thesis statements. The best way to do it, though, is to simply start with although, or though, or other key terms that state some type of contrast or difference. Although so-and-so thinks this, although this group of people say this, although these scientists have found this. And then you state the categories of your new claim, your new findings, your new reaction, and so on. And that's it. If you follow this simple strategy, you really will come up with some very good thesis statements. So what I would suggest is to try to write down a thesis statement, or a couple, and feel free to send them to me. I would love to give you a really quick critique on a thesis statement or 2. But remember, if you have time, never write a thesis statement just once. A thesis statement, just like your paper, because a thesis statement is the most important component of good writing at the college level, make sure that you revise until you're saying exactly what your paper is trying to argue. All right, that's it for today. See you next time. All right, let's go right ahead on to our introductions now. So we've discussed titles, how to write a good, effective title. We've discussed thesis statements, and again, I encourage all of you to send me a thesis statement or 2 and let me give you some feedback, some direct feedback on your thesis statement. The focus again of your thesis should be to state your claim and to set up the framework for your paper, with the main tip being keep it as narrow or make it as narrow as you can. But now let's go on to introductions. You may be wondering why, since most of us know that a thesis statement comes at the end of an introduction, why are we first now getting to introductions? And the reason is that without a thesis statement, you should never begin to write anything for your paper. Okay? Of course, that doesn't include pre-writing. Pre-writing is to help you develop a thesis statement. But after you've done your pre-writing exercises, you should never go on to an outline and never go on to actually drafting an introduction or the body of your paper without first developing at least somewhat of a working thesis. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a moment. First, let's discuss the purpose of an introduction. An introduction has 4 main purposes. First, a good introduction should catch the reader's attention. It should also set the topic up for discussion, involve the reader with the paper, and make a claim that will be supported throughout the paper. So this final one meaning, of course, your thesis statement. And that's it. An introduction, again, catch the reader's attention, set up the topic for discussion, so you give a little bit of background information of the topic, involve the reader with the paper, so get the reader engaged and invested into wanting to read your paper, and then state your thesis statement. Let's talk about, there are a couple of parts then to an introduction. There's the opener, the middle, and then again the thesis. And just to reemphasize, never write the introduction until you've already written your thesis. This doesn't mean you have to have a perfect thesis to start writing, but you need to have a draft of a thesis statement before you begin to write an introduction. But let's take each part of the introduction and give you a few tips to do each part well. First, in the opener, this is where you need to catch your reader's attention. It's also where you begin to set up your topic. It's important here, though, to be concise, to be to the point. What I mean by to the point is that a reader should know the general topic of your paper within the first couple of sentences. So I should not have to read 5 or even 10 sentences without already knowing clearly what the general topic of your paper is going to be about. Then we get on to the middle portion of the introduction. The middle portion is where you give a little bit more detail about the background of your topic, and is also where you briefly explain the context of your argument. Okay, so this is, as we showed in the introduction to our outlining exercise back in our writing process section. This is where I could, for example, provide the popular counter-arguments to our national curriculum debate. That would be in the middle of the introduction. Again, here we should be to the point, right? So we don't need to give so much detail and so much background and so much introduction. We just need to give enough so that when we come with the final part of the introduction, our thesis statement, we've provided enough background and enough context that the relevance of the thesis is clear. And again, just as a reminder, your thesis statement has those 2 purposes of stating your position clearly and concisely, and of providing a framework with these categories, right? The categories of discussion. So stating your position and providing a framework. Just as you should not start writing your introduction until you have your thesis statement, your entire paper is to work together to support this statement, including your introduction. So the entire paper is supporting this claim that you put forth in your thesis statement. So here are some basic do's and don'ts to come up with some effective introductions. There are more don'ts than do's, so let's focus on the do's first, and we'll worry about the don'ts here in a minute. First, develop a strong thesis before writing your introduction. I'm repeating this over and over again because students often like to draft and write before ever thinking of what their actual argument is. Second is a popular thing to do that helps to create an effective introduction. That is to use a surprising statistic. The only problem is you need to make sure it is accurate, so it's not a time to make up some crazy statistic so that people will gain interest in your paper. For example, 7 out of every 10 teenagers cannot read. I don't know if that is an accurate statistic, but if it was, this would be a great way to pull in your reader's attention. Another strategy is to state alarming information. Again, make sure it is accurate. An example of this could be mosquitoes kill more people every year than any other animal. Or this could be information that is not general knowledge or common knowledge, and it is alarming in a way. And again, this alarming information, just like the surprising statistic, pulls the reader in, makes them interested in what you're going to write. Finally, you need to be patient and allow yourself to write some sloppy first introductions. We all do it. And that's where the revision process of the step of revision in the writing process comes in, right? So we have to allow ourselves, we have to be patient to do something sloppy the first couple of times until we revise it into our polished product. Finally, let's get on to some don'ts. The first don't, never state the obvious. For example, teenagers love to have fun. Everyone knows that. I see this so often in my student papers, that we begin with this big, broad, general, obvious statement. The next don't is never begin with a generalization. For example, since the beginning of time, people have used tools. You're probably laughing at this, but you'd be surprised how often I see an obvious or a very general statement about all time or all history or all literature or all people. Never use such general terms in an introduction or in the rest of your paper. Next, don't give unnecessary details. Summarize the plot of some type of the research or of the story, or present irrelevant information. For example, Harry Potter is a British novel about a boy wizard who learns more and more about his magical powers until he finally defeats the antagonist. Never do this type or give this type of information in your introduction. It's boring. It makes the reader say, duh, and makes us simply not want to read your paper. Next, ask the question that your thesis answers. For example, turning to our discussion on the national curriculum. Did you know that the mandatory national curriculum is not as effective as it seems? So if you ask the question that your thesis answers, it kind of gives the reader the idea of what's the point of reading your entire paper if you're already asking the questions and already providing all the answers. What you need to do instead is to provide your thesis that gives your readers the opportunity to ask questions about your thesis. That's what will gain the reader's curiosity or their interest and make them want to read through your paper to see how you've proven your thesis or proven your claim. And finally, never give a history of your research. For example, after weeks of research in the library, I found 2 excellent books and 3 articles that discuss the nation's curriculum. Although this might be interesting to you, it might be a good personal note of how you did your research, in most cases it is very bland and very boring. Never give a history of your personal research into the topic. And that's it. If you follow the points in the do section of this slide and avoid the don'ts, especially if you develop a strong thesis statement, you're bound to have a strong introduction, which will gain your reader's interest, which will set up the topic for discussion, get the reader involved with the paper, and then it will make the claim that the rest of your paper will support. Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we are moving on with our section of organizing your ideas and talking now about paragraphs. So we've discussed titles, thesis statements, and introductions, and now we're moving on to the actual body paragraphs of our papers. So what is a paragraph? A good paragraph is a sequence of sentences that discusses a single idea. If you notice, I have bold, all caps, single, because this is the number one biggest mistake and the number one biggest thing you can do to improve the clarity of your writing, is that each paragraph discusses a single idea. I will be emphasizing this throughout the lecture today. Good paragraphs also clearly state that main idea or that single idea, and usually they do it in the topic sentence, which is in most cases the first sentence of the paragraph. Finally, a good paragraph uses all of the sentences in the paragraph to support that main idea. So we have no tangential sentences or sentences that go off topic. They all focus on the one main idea. There are 2 things that are key to developing good paragraphs. The first is unity. As I mentioned before, each paragraph should only discuss a single idea or topic. To create good unity, you need to announce that topic clearly in the first sentence of your paragraph. Let me show you an example. While traveling through Germany, I enjoyed a variety of delicious bratwursts. Clearly, the topic in this paragraph will be the variety of bratwursts. So all of the sentences that follow this topic sentence will discuss this variety of bratwursts. For example, here I have the middle sentences, which elaborate on the topic. I have Weißwurst, Frankfurter, Käsewurst, und Thüringer. So those are the 4 bratwursts that my paragraph about German, or the variety of German bratwursts, is going to discuss. And then we move on to our final sentence, which is both a restatement of the topic sentence and a transition into the next paragraph. So let's look at an example to illustrate how to transition with a final sentence into the next paragraph. So again, imagining this paragraph about German bratwursts, we have the topic sentence. While traveling through Germany, I enjoyed a variety of delicious bratwursts. Then I go through my middle sentences. I have a sentence or two about Weißwurst, about Frankfurters, Käsewurst, und Thüringer. So I have sentences using these as examples of the variety. And my final sentence could say something like, if only I could have enjoyed the German bratwursts together with the bread in France. So I'm transitioning into my next paragraph, which will be about the bread in France. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. A topic, one single topic, the middle sentences are examples or discussion of that topic. The final sentence restates that topic in a new way while transitioning into the next paragraph. The next key to a good, solid paragraph is coherence. So we have unity and coherence. Here are a few strategies for improving the coherence of your paragraphs. The first one is simply word repetition. Word repetition is straightforward. Repeat key words that you mentioned in your topic sentence throughout the paragraph. So in our bratwurst example, we would repeat the word bratwurst or variety throughout the paragraph, not overdoing it, of course, not repeating it in every sentence, but occasionally throughout the paragraph to keep the paragraph coherent on that single topic. Another strategy is to use pronouns effectively. So pronouns are a good way of carrying the main topic through each sentence without having to repeat the word so often. For example, my topic sentence was, while traveling through Germany, I enjoyed a variety of delicious bratwursts. The next sentence, they were different sizes, colors, and textures. And they is the pronoun used to refer to bratwursts, so that I don't have to continually repeat that word, bratwurst, bratwurst, bratwurst. Another strategy is to use related words. So use words that are related to the key topic words. Okay, so this is a way of repeating the key the topic without having to repeat the words so often. So from American movies, we could use a related word like Hollywood or the silver screen. So these related words are a way of tying the sentences together throughout the paragraph in a creative way and in a way that keeps you from repeating too much. The final strategy is very, very important. That is to use correct terms of transition or words to transition. For example, although, though, and however are words that show a shift in the discussion. Consequently, and therefore, show a cause and effect relationship. So it is important to use these types of words to transition because it signals to your reader what's happening in your discussion or what's happening in your argument. Okay, and those are 4 simple strategies to increase the coherence of your paragraphs. They're very important, and together with the unity of your paragraph, so topic sentence, middle sentences, and final transition sentence, these will really improve the paragraphs that you write in the body of your papers. Finally, we come to length. There is, of course, no real rule on how long a paragraph should or shouldn't be, but there is a general feel. For example, if a paragraph is too long, it's usually the sign that there are too many ideas crammed into a single paragraph. Remember, each paragraph should only focus on a single topic. If a paragraph is too short, that's usually the sign that there is not enough analysis or discussion of that topic. So it usually is the sign of superficial discussion or a lack of examples. So within each topic, there needs to be some good solid examples or within each paragraph, there needs to be a solid discussion and in-depth analysis with examples that present your topic clearly and effectively and persuasively. Finally, as if I haven't repeated this enough already, but again, I do this because it is the number one paragraph mistake that I see in student writing. Each paragraph should discuss a single idea that is directly connected to your thesis. Okay? Each paragraph discusses a single idea in depth with examples, with clear discussion and analysis that is directly related to your original thesis statement. And that's it for paragraphs. Feel free to send me any questions or comments you might have about your own paragraphs and things you're struggling with in the body paragraphs of your writing. Hello everyone, welcome back to our unit on organizing your ideas. Today's topic is transitions. So we've moved from titles to thesis statements to introductions. We've worked through paragraphs with brief discussions about transitions from one paragraph to the next. And today we're going to talk more broadly about transitions in general throughout your paper. We'll begin by discussing the purpose of transitions. The purpose of transitions is first to move your reader clearly through your argument. It keeps your readers from guessing or making their own conclusions. It also connects or shows relationship between your ideas. It enhances clarity, and it creates a flow from one sentence to the next, and from one paragraph to the next. So we use transitions throughout our paper continuously, or at least we should, and we use them specifically in various areas of our paper and for various purposes in each area. So the first area we use transitions is in sections to divide or to link major topics and ideas. The second is in paragraphs like we discussed last time, to divide or to link minor ideas. The third is in sentences, where we use transition terms or phrases in order to show the relationship between the various sentences within a paragraph. And finally is on the very minor level of within a sentence or parts of sentences, where we connect phrases or terms. And my main purpose today, we're not going to talk about this in too much detail actually, because it just takes practice, and it's usually just knowing the words and how to use the correct terms in order to transition effectively. So my main purpose today is to give you this list of transition types. Okay? So let's discuss just really briefly what the different types are, and then you can use this as a resource as you write to look back and find the best words of transition for you, depending on what you're trying to accomplish with that transition. So we have transition terms for addition, or where we're adding information or ideas, right? So we're adding something new. We have terms for chronology, which is when we're trying to lead our reader from one idea to the next. For example, after, before, earlier, finally, right? So we're leading our reader through a chronology of ideas or events. The next type of transition is to show similarity. Words like accordingly and also, which show that we're linking ideas or topics together because of their similarity. The fourth is location. The fifth is a result. So we use terms, key terms, such as accordingly, consequently, for this reason, in order to show that in order to signal to our reader that we're now discussing the results. The sixth is example. So when we're providing an example to our reader, we have, for example, in fact, specifically, right? These are all terms that signal to our reader that we're transitioning into an example. Next, we have summary. We need to show our reader that we're about to provide a summary of ideas. We use such terms as finally, in conclusion, in other words. And finally, notice my transition word I just used. Finally, we come to terms that show a transition according to difference. Although, however, nevertheless, these are all terms that show the reader that you are now transitioning from one idea to a different idea. Okay? And that's actually it for today. It's very short and brief. My goal is to illustrate or to highlight how important transitions are to the overall clarity of your writing, and also to provide this final slide here as a resource that you can come back to repeatedly as you write, so that you know which words to use, and you can use a variety of words to transition according to what type of transition you're trying to accomplish, whether it be addition, example, or difference. So if you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'd be happy to field any questions or comments that you might have. And thank you again for listening today. I look forward to our next lecture. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for sticking with me. We are on to conclusions today. So the final lecture of our section, Organizing Your Ideas. We've come up with a creative and incisive title. We have a solid thesis statement and introduction. Our body paragraphs are unified and coherent and transition well. And now we need to come up with a conclusion that leaves our paper with a bang. Alright, so like always, let's begin today by talking about the purpose of a conclusion. There are three main purposes that a good conclusion needs to satisfy. The first is to recall the purpose of your paper, or to recall your thesis statement. Not word for word. This is not a direct repetition of your thesis statement, but is to remind your reader of what your entire argument has been. The next purpose is to answer the so what, the who cares, why is this important? So what should your reader now understand having read your paper? And how does your argument speak to the larger issue? Finally, the third purpose of your conclusion should be to provide some sort of closure. So it should leave your readers thinking about your argument in a new and an interesting way. Before I get into some examples of conclusions today, though, let's give you some strategies or some tips. My first strategy I would suggest is to always quickly skim your paper to remember how your argument has developed. Usually we write papers over a number of days, weeks, or even months. If we want to write a good conclusion the first time through, we need to look back and remind ourselves of how our argument has developed, so that we know how to restate the argument in the final conclusion. You should ask yourselves questions like, why are my ideas important? Why should my readers care? The conclusion is not a time for preaching, and not a time to provide the moral of the story. It is also never a time to introduce a new idea that was not ever discussed in the body of the paper. You should never introduce new ideas, even if they're cool and creative and interesting. If you do not have time to discuss them within your paper, the conclusion is not the time to introduce them. Rather, what you should do is spin your already discussed ideas in a new and interesting way. And I'll show you some examples of this in just a moment. You also need to remember to fit the conclusion, or the length of the conclusion, to the length of the paper. So if you have a shorter paper, say less than 8 pages, a 1 paragraph or 1 to 2 paragraph conclusion is perfectly adequate, as long as you write it well. If your paper is much longer than that, a 1 to 2 paragraph conclusion will seem very short and seem inadequate of providing the conclusion that is necessary for a longer paper. Finally, my last tip is never begin your conclusion with the phrase, "in conclusion." The main reason is because you're more creative than that. At least I hope so. Let's go ahead and look at a couple of examples of good conclusions and the different types of conclusions that work effectively. The first is to suggest a course of action. In your paper, you've argued that in order to celebrate the United States as a multicultural society, American citizens need to stop supporting the ongoing oppression of minority groups through their economic and political choices. So again, that's the main argument of your paper. So to suggest a course of action, we have this conclusion. People of the United States continue to hold up their country as the world's symbol of freedom. To live up to this ideal, however, American citizens must begin to realize that through many of their day-to-day economic decisions, They unknowingly support the very structures, systems, and corporations that continue to oppress the minority ethnic, religious, and gender groups of America. Okay, so we're suggesting a course of action with words like American citizens must begin to realize, right? So we're suggesting what American citizens need to do after having read the paper that we've just delivered. The next example of a conclusion is a personal application. So here again, we're using that same paper topic that we just used for the previous conclusion. And here we have tracing the flow of my personal purchases from the cashiers to the corporate elite, and from the corporate elite to the upholding of oppressive social systems and structures, has forever altered how I choose to use my purchasing power. So again, here it's a very personal application of what I'm going to do or how I have changed because of the findings that I've discussed in my paper. The next example is to show the issue's relevance. Again, we're using the same topic for each of these conclusions. American politicians have too long overlooked American minorities in favor of keeping American corporations competitive internationally. As a result, ethnic, religious, and gender minorities continue to be oppressed. The greatest irony, however, is that everyday American citizens continue to support this ongoing oppression through their day-to-day economic decisions. To give money to the corporations that uphold oppressive structures is to blindly oppress ourselves. Okay, so here we're clarifying the relevance of the larger issue at hand. And finally, our last conclusion example is to refer back to a quotation from the body of the paper. So to bring the whole paper full circle by referring back to a key quotation. Here we have, America continues to serve as the economic center of the world, the pinnacle of economic freedom. As Phil Ox sings, however, the United States is only as rich as the poorest of the poor, reminding America that the apparent economic freedom of America's elite continues to come at the cost of America's impoverished. Okay, so here we refer back to a key quote that sums up the main topic and also points to the larger issue at hand. And these are 4 very good examples. Let's review them one more time. We have suggest a course of action, a personal application, to show the issue's relevance, and then to refer back to a quotation from the body of the paper. Of course, you don't want to do all of these within one conclusion, but depending on what your argument is in your paper, any one of these could be a very good tool to use to format a solid conclusion to your paper. And that concludes for us Unit 3, so we'll see you next time for the beginning lecture on Unit 4. And we're back. Welcome back, everyone. We're now on to Unit 3, Developing Your Writing Style. So we've talked about the writing process. I hope you guys are working your way through each step of the writing process for each of your assignments or each of your writing projects. We've also discussed how to organize your ideas through clear thesis statements, paragraphs, transitioning, conclusions, and so on. And today we're going to begin to talk about your writing style. Throughout this section, I'm going to give you different strategies for improving your writing style and bringing it up to that college level. And today, the first strategy is parallel structure. So what parallel structure is the idea of using the same grammatical structure to express equal ideas in a sequence. The purpose is it increases clarity. So how do we do this? There are a number of ways to do parallel structure. The first way is through coordinating conjunctions. Coordinating conjunctions, of course, are words like and, but, yet, or, and nor. To do a parallel structure correctly, you need to use the same grammatical structure on both sides of a coordinating conjunction. So let's look at some examples. First, an awkward example, and one that happens way too often. I love to eat and go drinking at restaurants. So here we have 2 different tenses of the verb. We have before and, we have eat, and after and, we have go drinking. In other words, we're using 2 different grammatical structures on each side of the conjunction. A better way to do it would be, I love to eat and to drink at restaurants. You could also change it to I love eating and drinking at restaurants. The point here being that no matter which way you want to change it, the structure on both sides of the conjunction and need to be the same. Good. So another way to do parallel structure well is through correlative conjunctions. Correlative conjunctions are things like either or, neither nor, whether or, not only but also. In order to have a good parallel structure, we need to use again the same grammatical structure when using correlative conjunctions. So exactly the same as coordinating conjunctions. We have first an awkward example. Today's assignment is neither to solve a problem nor writing a paper. A better way to write that by using parallel structure, a way to make that more clear would be, today's assignment is neither to solve a problem nor to write a paper. Again, another correct way to do that would be, today's assignment is neither solving a problem nor writing a paper. So to create parallel structure, we simply need to, when we're using conjunctions, we need to use the same grammatical structure. The same idea comes with lists. When we have a sequence or a list in our writing, we need to use the same grammatical structure throughout the entire list. So for an awkward example, again, we have the best students work hard, submit their work on time, and aren't wasting their time on the weekends. If you notice, we've shifted the grammatical structure after the last comma in our sentence, so with the last item in our list. The correct way to do this would be to keep it grammatically or structurally the same. The best students work hard, submit their work on time, and don't waste time on the weekends. Okay, so you see this is getting kind of repetitive, but it's to drill in this idea that parallel structure simply means using the same grammatical structures in these different scenarios with coordinating conjunctions, correlative conjunctions, and in your lists. Finally, we also need to use parallel structure in our clauses and our phrases. So here, rather than using the same grammatical structure, we need to use the same clausal structure to show the relationship between equal clauses. So let's begin again with an awkward example. With the players' dedication to each other, and when the coach supports the players, the soccer team could have a successful season. So let's revise this to make it correct. With the players' dedication to each other, and with the coach's support of the players, the soccer team could have a successful season. Another correct way of doing this would be, when the players are dedicated to each other, and when the coach supports the players, the soccer team could have a successful season. Finally, another correct version would be, if the players are dedicated to each other, and the coach supports the players, the soccer team could have a successful season. So in this, the very first, the awkward version, has two different clausal structures. We have with the players and when the coach. In the first correction, we change them both to with. The second correction, we've changed them both to when. And then in the third correction, we've used if and eliminated the second one. So we just have if the players are dedicated and the coach supports. So they're all tied back to if. Again here, the focus is that the clausal structure remains the same. Just as before, in order to create parallel structure, our grammatical structures need to remain the same. We do this to add clarity, and it is very important that you begin to adopt this strategy into your own writing style. And that's it for today. We'll see you next time. Okay, as we move on with our section on developing your writing style, we move from parallel structure to sentence structure. The first idea of today's lecture is the need to vary your sentence structure. So if we're always writing in the same structural sentences, it's very likely that your reader will become very disinterested. So we need to vary our sentence structure through simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences, and compound complex sentences. And we'll talk about each of these today. The first is the simple sentence. We all know what a simple sentence is, but as a review, a simple sentence is an independent clause, so a phrase that can stand alone as a complete sentence. It means it only has one subject-verb combination. So let's look at some examples. Superman flies very fast. Batman and Superman are both superheroes, and Batman punches harder than Superman. I know some of you might want to argue the opposite. However, these are just examples of simple sentences. The next is the compound sentence. A compound sentence is where two or more independent clauses are joined together. They're often joined by a semicolon, a colon, or a conjunction. So last time we talked about coordinating conjunctions or correlative conjunctions. We use those conjunctions to build compound sentences. So let's look at some examples again. Superman's nickname is the Man of Steel, but I think he is as tough as titanium. The Superman vs. Batman Celebrity Showdown will be televised on Friday. Batman better bring some kryptonite. So again, these are just two examples of compound sentences where two independent clauses are joined together, either through punctuation, semicolon, colon, or conjunction. The next is the complex sentence. A complex sentence is an independent clause that also has one or more dependent clauses. So if we remember from our English classes, a dependent clause is a clause that is not a complete sentence on its own. In other words, it does not have a verb-noun combination. So here are some examples again, following our Marvel Comics theme. Even if Batman brings kryptonite, he will never win. So even if Batman brings kryptonite is the dependent clause, and then the independent clause is he will never win. So it's a complex sentence because there's a dependent and an independent combined together. The next example is Batman will never win even if he brings kryptonite. So we've simply switched it around. We've put the independent clause first and the dependent clause second. Okay, very basic. Finally, we have the compound complex sentence. That is when two or more independent clauses, one or more dependent clauses, and two or more subject-verb combinations are all within one sentence. The example is, when the Celebrity Showdown comes to an end, we will finally know whether Batman or Superman is the strongest, and the weaker one will forever let down his fans. So here we have multiple independent clauses. We have a dependent clause, the very first one, when the Celebrity Showdown comes to an end, is a dependent clause. And we have multiple subject-verb combinations. So I'm reviewing these types of sentences with you simply to illustrate that you need to vary your sentence structure in order to keep your reader interested, in order to persuasively present your ideas. We cannot only have simple sentences, and on the other side, we can't only have compound complex sentences. Compound complex sentences, one after the other, will quickly lose your reader and your ideas. On the other hand, simple sentences, one after the other, will oversimplify your ideas and not show the connections that other sentence structures may be able to provide. So along with parallel structure, the next strategy of developing your writing style is to vary your sentence structure between these multiple sentence types. Okay, and again, as always, please send me any questions you might have about how to effectively vary your sentence structure. Today we will continue developing your writing style by discussing the idea of avoiding shifts. What I mean by shifts is when we switch between verb tenses, persons, voices, and so on. And when we do this, it tends to confuse the reader. The goal is to always be consistent. We're going to talk about a number of shifts that happen often in student writing, just to point them out to you, and also to see how to avoid or to revise in order to avoid shifting. The first common shift is shifting the verb tense. So verb tense is what shows when the action of a sentence takes place. So we have present tense, of course. I ride my bike to school. I am riding my bike to school is what's called the present continuous. In the past tense, I rode my bike to school. In the future, I will ride my bike to school. Of course, there are more than these three tenses. However, these simply illustrate what it is the tense does. It shows the action of the sentence and when it takes place. The idea is to be consistent. So let's look at an incorrect example. I rode my bike to school and yell, "Watch out! my brakes don't work. So here we have past and present. Past rode, present yell. In other words, it's inconsistent. To correct that, we need to either change them both to the present or both to the past. Here I've changed them both to the past. I rode my bike to school and yelled, "Watch out, my brakes don't work." So the only time we should be shifting the verb tense is when the time of the action shifts within a sentence. So look at this example. I will ride my bike to school again on Monday, exactly 3 months since I got in an accident and broke my arm. So here you'll see we've shifted from future tense to the past tense. The reason being that the time of the action within the sentence shifted. So our verb tenses followed the time of the action. So we never shift the verb tense within a sentence unless the time within the sentence or the time of the action within the sentence also shifts. The next common shift that we need to avoid is shifting person. By person I mean first, second, and third person. Again, the solution is to be consistent. This one, for a strange reason, is very, very common. Let's look at an incorrect sentence. If one forgets to look both ways before crossing the street, you might get hit by a car. So we have one and you. We've shifted, right? Well, in order to make that consistent and therefore correct, we need to have, if you forget to look both ways before crossing the street, you might get hit by a car. Or the extra formal way, if one forgets to look both ways before crossing the street, one might get hit by a car. So no matter what person we are using, whether it's first, second, or third, we need to always remember to keep it consistent throughout the sentence. The next shift is between active and passive voice. Active, we know, is when the subject performs the action, and passive voice is when the subject receives the action. Again, the rule of thumb is be consistent. So in our incorrect example, we have, we ate our dinner, then our dishes were put in the dishwasher. So we ate our dinner as active, and then in the following clause, we shift back into the present, we shift back into passive when we say, then our dishes were put in the dishwasher. Okay, so we've shifted from active to passive. We need to be consistent, and therefore the correct example is we ate our dinner, then we put our dishes in the dishwasher. Okay, so we have active in both sides. We could have also changed it to have passive in both sides or both clauses. Either way, we just need to stay consistent. Let's go now to dialogue. Dialogue is another common shifting error that we have in student writing. Dialogue, of course, is the exchange of statements or questions. What we need to avoid is shifting between dialogue and indirect discourse within the same sentence. So let's look at an example, an incorrect example. Wendy asked, "Where did Mom go? And when she was coming back?" We have a dialogue, where did Mom go? The question in quotation marks. And then we have indirect discourse, when she was coming back. We can't have both in the same sentence. A correct way of doing it would be, Wendy asked, "Where did Mom go? And when is she coming back?" So here we have direct quotations or direct dialogue in both instances. The other way to fix it would be to use indirect discourse both times. Wendy asked where her mom had gone and when she would be coming back. Okay? So these, again, they're all very self-explanatory, and the examples are very repetitive, but I'm drilling into the idea that we need to be consistent. To develop a good writing style, we need to avoid shifts. The next shift that happens so often in student writing is shifting the number. So by number, I'm referring to the use of singular or plural nouns and pronouns. Again, the rule, be consistent. So the incorrect example would be, if a student forgets his or her homework, they cannot submit it late. So correct would be, if a student forgets his or her homework, he or she cannot submit it late. And to be honest, this is the correct way, but it just gets jumbled to have all of these his or hers, he's and she's, and so on. So the best way to do it is simply to use the plural. If students forget their homework, they cannot submit it late. It's a very simple solution to the number shifting problem. Simply use the plural in both sides. You don't have to, but it's the easiest strategy for avoiding a shift in number. Another common shift is to a shift of mood. Mood is the writer's attitude and intentions. So there are 3 different types of moods. We have the indicative, which is to make a statement, to state a fact or opinion, or to ask a question. We have the imperative, which gives a command. And we have the subjunctive, or the conditional, which indicates a wish, a suggestion, a hypothesis, etc. Again, the rule. See if you can guess. Be consistent. Good. Incorrect. Take 2 Tylenol, and then you should call the doctor in the morning if you're still not feeling better. So here we have take 2, which is the imperative, followed by the subjunctive or conditional, you should, so a suggestion. The correct way would be to keep it consistent. Here I'm keeping it consistent by using the indicative in both cases. Take 2 Tylenol and then call the doctor in the morning if you're still not feeling better. We could have changed it to use subjunctive in both, but I changed it to use indicative. Oh, sorry, imperative. I changed it to use imperative. Finally, the last shift that is common in student writing and needs to be fixed to write successfully at the college level is a shift in style. So style refers to the idea of formal, informal, poetic, personal, and so on. Guess again what the rule is? Be consistent. So informal, when my mom heard about the weekend, she freaked. Formal, when my mother heard about the weekend, she became very upset. Okay, so we need to not switch in between the two. For example, if I were to say, when my mother heard about the weekend, she freaked. It could be very inconsistent. Mother is more formal than mom, and freaked is obviously quite informal or casual. So we would need to have, when my mother heard about the weekend, she became very upset. The last rule is to remember your audience when it comes to avoiding shifts in style. Remember your audience and write accordingly, and then stay consistent within that style. Whether it's a formal audience, an informal audience, or a personal audience, keep that same style throughout. Okay, so that's it for today. Remember the rule, no matter which shift we're talking about, whether it's mood, style, number, dialogue, active or passive, person, or verb tense, we need to stay consistent. As always, if you have any questions, go ahead and shoot me an email, and I'll try to clear it up for you. Alright, we've mentioned today's topic a number of times now. It's time we talk in more detail about passive and active voice. This has a lot to do with developing a good writing style. So active versus passive voice is what describes the relationship between the subject and the verb or the action of each sentence. Active, as you probably already know, is when the subject performs the action. By using the active voice, your style is usually more direct, clear, dramatic, and concise. An example, the big burly man ate the whole box of donuts. The passive voice is when the subject receives the action. What happens when passive voice is used too frequently is it can confuse a reader by making it difficult to identify the actor within a sentence or within a paragraph. For example, the whole box of donuts was eaten by the big burly man. So we have that as an example of passive. Imagine if we were to have a number of different actions without ever naming the specific actor. Okay, we could imagine that that would confuse the reader much more than the direct use of active voice. My suggestion is to use passive wisely. One way to use passive wisely is when the actor is honestly unknown. For example, the man was robbed around 6:30 p.m. on Friday. We don't know who robbed the man, so the actor is unknown, and it's a good time to use passive voice. Another time to use passive wisely is when the actor does not need to be known. For example, on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. So here the emphasis or the focus is the Declaration of Independence or the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and so it's unnecessary to know who the main actor or actors were. Finally, adding to the second point is to emphasize the action rather than the actor. For example, gravity was discovered by Sir Isaac Newton. Here we're emphasizing the act of discovering gravity rather than the actor Sir Isaac Newton. In general, however, it's best to avoid using passive voice whenever you can. Active voice, as we already discussed, is more concise, more concrete, more direct, and more dramatic. It makes for a much better read. So check your uses of passive voice during the revision process. Passive voice, again, begins with all of these be verbs, is, are, was, were, and so on, together with a past participle of the verb. So it's very easy to catch when you're rereading your paper. What you need to do when you find a passive, whenever possible, is to convert that passive into active voice. For example, terrible papers are often written by great students. Okay, we have are written, so passive, a be verb together with a past participle. Are written is passive tense. So let's convert that now into active. Great students often write terrible papers. But not you, of course. Especially after working through this course and taking it seriously, or taking my offer seriously of getting a paper reviewed and having a one-on-one consultation. We're going to make you a successful writer. But for today, in order to develop a strong writing style, lean as much as you can toward the active voice. Again, you use passive occasionally, and you can use it wisely with the points we've just discussed. But for the majority of your writing, as you use the active voice, your writing will improve. So send me your questions and comments about active and passive voice, and we'll see you again next time for our next lecture. Last time on our lecture of developing your writing style, we talked about how using active voice is much more concise than using passive voice. Today's lecture is all about concision. So beyond just changing your passive voice to active, we're going to talk about some strategies of how to write more concisely. Concision is key to a persuasive argument and key to good college writing. So the opposite of concision is, of course, wordiness, which is simply using more words than are necessary. The goal of today's lecture is to give you some strategies on how to eliminate wordiness. The first way that students are often wordy is by using unnecessary introductory words. For example, now that I think about it, I remember having a great time on our cruise. A much more concise way would be to say, I remember having a great time on our cruise. So we get rid of that wordy introduction. Another cause for wordiness is unnecessary relative clauses. Here we have, the corn which is sold at the farmer's market that takes place every Saturday is fresher than in the supermarket. Here we have a number of relative clauses. We have, which is sold at the farmer's market, and that takes place every Saturday. So we have two relative clauses within that sentence. Let's make that more concise. The corn sold at the farmer's market every Saturday is fresher than in the supermarket. So I'm not saying you should never use relative clauses, but relative clauses should only be used to add clarification or meaning to the sentence. Okay, so with our concise version here, we are not losing any meaning or clarification than our wordy sentence with those multiple relative clauses. So we need to cut out any relative clauses that are not adding clarification or meaning. Another common wordiness issue is when we use too many prepositional phrases. Let's look at an example. Professional chefs are required by their employers to wash their hands in the bathroom before preparing food in the kitchen of the restaurant where they work. Okay, so this one's over the top wordy. We have here how many prepositional phrases? By their employers, 1. In the bathroom, 2. Before preparing food, 3. In the kitchen, 4. And of the restaurant, 5. We have 5 prepositional phrases within this one sentence. Let's see if we can make that more concise. Professional chefs are required to wash their hands before preparing food in a restaurant. Okay, so we have basically the exact same meaning in almost 2 lines less. Okay, so hopefully this is emphasizing how writing more concise really cuts down the wordiness while still maintaining the same meaning. Another way to be more concise is to get rid of vague nouns. Let's look at an example. The arrival of the police did not calm the nature of the protest dilemma. Let's see how many nouns we have in here. We have the arrival, police, nature, protest, dilemma. We have 5 nouns in one sentence. Let's make this more concise. The arrival of the police did not calm the protest. Notice we're not losing any meaning, but we've cut that down from 5 nouns to 3 nouns. Here's something that I need to work on when I speak. My writing is fine in being concise, but when I speak, I repeat too often. When we write, we need to be more concise. We cannot use unnecessary repetition. So, before the soccer game, we stopped to buy a sports drink. The sports drink we bought for the soccer game was grape-flavored. The grape-flavored sports drink was just what I needed during the soccer game. Let's make this more concise. Before the soccer game, we stopped to buy a grape-flavored sports drink. It was just what I needed during the game. So instead of repeating soccer and grape and flavor over and over and over again, we use pronouns to replace those words and make it more concise. We cut out the repetition. One more example of wordiness, a common example of wordiness, is lengthy modifiers. Here we have the accident happened as a result of the 2 drivers not paying attention. Instead of that modifier as a result of, we could simply use the word because. The accident happened because the 2 drivers were not paying attention. So the difference in these 2 sentences is not as dramatic as in the previous examples. However, it is still a significant change toward a more concise writing style. Finally, a review from last time. Make passive voice active. So we have the wordy example. The computers had been stolen by the thief just before midnight. Instead, let's make it more concise by converting the passive sentence into active. The thief stole the computers just before midnight. So it is important as you write to consider how wordy you are being, how much you are repeating yourself, how many lengthy modifiers you are using, how many vague nouns or prepositional phrases or relative clauses are you using. If we can cut those down already in the initial writing, we are way ahead in the revision process. As we revise, though, we also need to be looking for ways we can cut our writing down or cut the wordiness out in order to have a more concise and direct style of writing. College writing praises concision. And I'd be happy to look at an example paragraph to give you some feedback on how to make your writing more concise. So send it on my way, and we'll see you next time. On today's lecture of developing your writing style, we're moving on to talk about diction and vocabulary building. So as we all know, there are different levels of diction. There's formal diction, which you may use in academic or highly educated audiences, scholarly journals, religious sermons, and so on. There's standard diction, which is a well-educated audience, so most common diction for college papers, professional communications, and mass publications. And then there's the informal diction, which is familiar or specific audience, something you use when you write personal letters, emails, so it's meant for conversation or entertainment. Let's look at a couple of examples. In formal diction, we have accredit. A similar word for standard would be acknowledge, and informal, give a shout out. Formal, delineate. Standard would be explain. Informal would be give the lowdown. And formal again would be cajole, standard flatter, and informal kiss up to. While we look at this, it's important to realize as a college student you do not need to force yourself into formal diction if those are words that you are not already familiar with. Of course, as you learn new words, begin to incorporate those into your writing. However, no professor is going to look at your use of standard diction, for example, acknowledge rather than accredit. No professor is going to look down on that. Professors will, however, look down on incorrect uses of formal diction. So if you're trying to use words you don't quite understand, you're not quite familiar with, and you use them wrongly, that's when professors will look down on your diction. Okay? So when it comes to diction and developing your own writing style, it's important to know how to choose the level of diction you should use. As I already mentioned, for most college papers, a standard level of diction is completely adequate, but within your own style, you can also develop your own level of diction, right? So the first important question is regarding your audience. For whom are you writing? Each audience has a different expectation of your diction. Then we ask, what's the purpose? In other words, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to inform your audience, persuade your audience, illustrate to your audience, analyze something for your audience, or to entertain your audience? Your diction would then shift accordingly. So after you've decided on who your audience is and what the purpose of your writing is for that audience, let me give you a few warnings in regards to diction. First, avoid biased language when you are passionate about a topic. Never use racist or sexist language. Never use language biased against sexual orientation, religion, or ethnicity. Avoid making moral judgments. Never generalize groups by the actions of individuals. So avoid terms like always or never, everyone, no one. Remember that overly formal language is pretentious. Right? If that's not your standard vocabulary, your standard level of diction, don't try to push yourself, again, as a reminder, don't try to push yourself into an overly formal diction for your college papers. It will be viewed as pretentious. Never use a word you cannot define if asked. This is, again, along those same lines. If you use any word in your writing that you cannot define on the spot, it's best to use a word that you can. Finally, keep your level of diction consistent, unless shifting levels communicates a certain idea or point. In other words, throughout your papers, don't shift between formal, standard, and informal, back and forth. You need to keep it consistent once you've chosen which level of diction you want to use, unless within the paper you're trying to communicate a certain idea or point, and that shift in diction is exactly what you would like to use in order to illustrate that point. Now on to vocabulary building. So I've warned against using words we don't already know how to define or trying to elevate our diction. Of course, writing is also a practice of learning language, right? Of building our vocabulary. So there are two levels of vocabulary building. The first is to transfer the words you do not recognize to recognition. The next step is to transfer those words that you can now recognize into general use. And this is where I think the balance of vocabulary building and using an appropriate level of diction in college writing is very important, right? So you should be using words, at least the majority of the words you should use should be words that you'd also be using in conversation, that you've begun to recognize and then transferred from recognition into general usage. And in order to do that, in order to be able to first recognize a word and then be able to transfer that new recognition into general use, which will then be used in your writing as well, there are a few vocabulary building strategies. The first is to recognize the context that the word is being used in. So how is a new word being used in the sentence? After you've guessed at the meaning of a word based on the context, then look it up. I recommend using the Oxford English Dictionary so you know you have the official definition. And then it's important to look up synonym and antonym pairs. So an example would be phlegmatic, having a calm disposition. Synonyms would be calm, composed, imperturbable. An antonym would be excitable. So looking up the synonyms and antonym pairs of new words is a great way to solidify their meaning and the recognition of those words into your mind so that you can transfer those words into general use. Remember also that using new words is not supercilious or snobbish, right? It's important. Part of your college experience is to learn and to use new words. Again, there's that balance, that fine balance between which new words can I already use in my writing. Remember the rule, never use a word you cannot define if asked. So if you're to the point that you've recognized a word, you've learned a new word and put it into general use, and if I or any professor were to ask you, okay, what does this word mean? And you can define it, then you're ready to put it into your writing. But conversation is a good place to experiment with new words. The final strategy is to look up other language influences. So Greek and Latin prefixes, roots, and suffixes, for example. Knowing that the Latin prefix ante means before helps understand the words antebellum, antecede, antechamber, and so on. German, French, and Hebrew have also highly influenced the English language. Now, I don't recommend you going out and trying to learn all these languages, but looking up the influences from other languages is also a great way of remembering what the word is, what it means, and how to use it. All right, so I hope this helps. Remember, you need to identify the audience you're writing to, identify the level of diction that is appropriate for that audience, and then pay attention to these warnings that I've listed out. At the same time, remember to be an active learner of new words, right? To transfer those words that you do not already know into recognition, and then from recognition into general use, and from general use into your writing. All right, and that's it for today. We're now on to our final lecture in section 3. Today we'll be talking about how to use quotations correctly and effectively, and how to avoid plagiarism. First, why do we use quotations? We use quotations to refer to an expert's ideas and to illustrate a conversation within discipline-specific research. So at the college level, when we write, depending on the assignment, but for many assignments, our goal is to develop and to express our own ideas in a persuasive manner. We use quotations to show how our ideas are in conversation, either in support of, being supported by, or an argument against others' ideas. And there are 3 main forms of incorporating others' ideas. The first is, of course, a direct quotation. The second is summary. And the third is to paraphrase. It's important to remember that each of these is using someone else's ideas. All right, so even if we're summarizing or paraphrasing, we still need to cite our sources because we are using someone else's ideas. When using someone else's ideas or incorporating someone else's ideas, I want to remind you of a tool or a strategy I taught early on in this course. That is the purpose of life, or the purpose of a quotation. The purpose of life, or the purpose of quotation, has 3 parts. First, where did I come from? Second, why am I here? And third, where am I going? And this is a strategy to remind ourselves that we need to transition both into someone else's ideas and back out of someone else's ideas into our own writing. So the where did I come from is the idea of introducing the quotation. Why am I here is the quotation itself or the other person's ideas. And where am I going is the commentary or analysis of the quotation. So your individual, your personal commentary and analysis of the quotation you've provided. So let's talk about each part of that purpose of life idea in a little bit more depth. So I'll give you some ideas of how to introduce a quotation and how to transition back out of a quotation. First, we'll look at introducing a quotation. The reason we introduce a quotation is to prepare your reader to hear someone else's voice. And there are 2 main ways of doing this. The first is to contextualize. So this gives a sense of where you are taking the quotation from. Let me show you an example. In his 2014 Udemy course on academic writing, an all-in-one crash course to college writing, Taylor argues that writing is both an art and a science. Okay, so we contextualize by identifying exactly where you're taking this quotation from. Another way of preparing your reader to hear someone else's voice is to defend or to show the authority of the speaker. Another example. Mike Taylor, PhD candidate in English at the University of British Columbia, agrees that good writing is both an art and a science. So here we list qualifications, right? We show the authority of the speaker. As you develop your own writing style, there are, of course, other ways of introducing quotations. My goal today is simply to emphasize the importance of introducing your quotations and giving you 2 basic strategies of how to do that. And now I'll skip over the quotation itself, or the why am I here, simply because that's where you insert the other person's ideas, either in the form of direct quotation, summary, or paraphrase. And we'll move straight on then to the commentary or analysis. Commentary and analysis, in my mind, is the most important element of incorporating quotations. So it's showing your engagement, your personal engagement with other people's ideas. As a general rule in your papers altogether, you should have more commentary or analysis than the quotation, paraphrase, or summary itself. In other words, if you have a 4-line quotation, you need to have ample discussion of that quotation. So a 1-line summary of that quotation is not going to cut it, right? You do this by first speaking directly to the quotation's significance. So you never assume your quotations will speak for themselves. what they say to you may come across completely differently to your reader. So you need to explain this to your reader. What is so significant about the passage that you've chosen to quote, the passage that you've chosen to paraphrase? Why did you choose that one specifically? And so on. Tell your readers how to read the quotation to ensure they understand it the same way that you do. While doing this, you should never simply restate the quotation in other words. That is not commentary or analysis of the quotation or the ideas that you're citing. It is also important to maintain your own voice throughout your paper rather than creating a list of others' ideas. So this is why we comment or analyze the quotations that we do use, is because the goal is to highlight our own voice, our own ideas, not to simply list others. Finally, select quotations that support your ideas rather than molding your ideas to support the quotations. It becomes very obvious in student writing when a student is simply regurgitating a whole bunch of other people's ideas rather than demonstrating a student's own engagement with those ideas, right? So rather than simply adopting other people's ideas, always establish your thesis, or at least a working thesis first, and then find quotations that support your thesis, that build your thesis. A couple of important strategies for using quotations also include the sentence structure of that quotation. You, as the author of your paper, have the freedom of changing the quotations a little bit in order to agree with for example, you can use brackets. Use brackets to change the tense or person of a quotation to match the tense of your sentence. For example, Harrison remarked that she always hoped to change the world with her music, and that's just what she has done. The original quotation says, I always hope to change the world with my music. Okay, so we've changed the tense to past tense, and we've changed the person from first person to third person. We also use brackets to add your own words to clarify. For example, Jones read her stories at the care center to lift up the patient's spirits. Original quotation, Jones read her stories to lift up the patient's spirits. So we've used brackets to clarify exactly where she is reading her stories. Another thing we do in our sentence structure is the use of an ellipsis. We use this to omit unnecessary words from the original quotation. So lots of times we want just parts of a quotation, parts of someone else's ideas, right? And so we use an ellipsis to omit these unnecessary words in between those parts. For example, the original quotation is from Huckleberry Finn, just because you're taught that something's right and everyone believes it's right, it don't make it right. I, for my paper, don't want the middle part, so I'm going to use an ellipsis and omit that. And so now it will read, just because you are taught that something's right, it don't make it right. Finally, to form an ellipsis, remember that you need a space between each period. Lots of students just type period, period, period really fast, right? 3 periods. But that's not actually an ellipsis. An ellipsis is with a space between each. Finally, something extremely important in college writing, because no professor ever wants to have to fail a student, which is usually the university policy for plagiarism, is how to use others' ideas while avoiding plagiarism. And it's actually quite simple. You simply need to always, no matter what, cite the source of your quotation, summary, or paraphrase. Okay, so no matter what, if you're ever using someone else's ideas, if you're not the one coming up with the idea on your own, then you need to cite. I'm going to show you just one basic citation format, one that's very common in basic college writing, which is MLA. At the end of this slide, you'll see I've added a link so that you can check out a very popular academic writing website that will walk you through some of the other popular citation styles or citation guides. But for today, we'll just talk about MLA. And again, I'm only giving you the very basics of in-text citations or quotations used within your writing. First, if you mention the author's name in the introductory sentence, you only need to include the page number in parentheses. So, for example, Mark Twain writes, just because you're taught that something's right and everyone believes it's right, it don't make it right. Then in parentheses, we do 48, and then a period outside of the parentheses. So no period within the quotation marks. Instead, we put that on the very end, outside of the final citation. If the author's name is not mentioned, then you do need to include the author's last name and page number. I agree that just because you're taught that something's right and everyone believes it's right, it don't make it right. And then we have Twain, 48. So you can see we don't have to write an abbreviation of page or the number sign or anything else. Simply the author's last name and then the number. So author's last name, space, page number. Okay, and again, as I promised, here's a link to probably the most comprehensive online source and reliable source. Alright, we're on to section 4, punctuation crash course. So I do this crash course on punctuation not because this should be the focus of our writing, or that we should think that because we punctuate well, our writing is somehow good. We've discussed the writing process, we've discussed how to organize our ideas, how to write good paragraphs, how to write good conclusions, and so on. That's the focus of college writing. A punctuation crash course is simply to remember the things we should have already learned in previous English classes in high school and throughout our lives, and also just to refine or to clean up our writing so that it's not sloppy with punctuation mistakes. So let's start today by talking about commas and comma splices. First, we'll discuss when to use commas properly. The first place to use commas is in a series. So commas separate the different items in a series or list. And remember that a conjunction, and or will follow the last comma. And some people debate whether or not that's necessary, that we need a comma at the end. In college writing, always put a comma before the and or the or at the end of your list or series. For example, I visited the museum with Sarah, Rachel, and Mike. Okay, so comma between each item in the list, and an and a comma before the last conjunction or and in the list. We also need to remember when we use terms like etc. or so forth, that those are preceded by and followed by a comma. For example, I went with Sarah, Rachel, etc. to the museum. It's kind of a silly sentence, but that's how we would punctuate a sentence like that. Sarah, Rachel, etc., comma. Good. Another example, I told the lawyer about the accident, the victims, and so forth before I went to court. So a comma before and after words like etc. and so forth. Good. The next time we use a comma is in introductory phrases. Introductory phrases are those at the beginning of a sentence that explain when, where, why, how, or the circumstances of the action occurring in the sentence. For example, when Sam turns 16, he will receive his driver's license. So we don't use a comma if a verb directly follows the introductory phrase. For example, from the sky fell the skydiver. However, if a verb does not directly follow the introductory phrase, if the noun or the subject follows, then we need to have a comma after that introductory phrase. We also use a comma after a conjunctive adverb at the beginning of a sentence. For example, nevertheless. Nevertheless, the artist's favorite medium is watercolor. Okay, so after conjunctive adverbs like nevertheless, we need a comma when it's at the beginning of a sentence. And also within this introductory phrase category, we have interjections. So we always need a comma if we have an interjection at the beginning of a sentence, like, no way, I hope he's okay. Another time we use commas is with independent clauses. Independent clauses, or an independent clause, is a group of words that can be a sentence on its own. So we need to use a comma when two independent clauses are combined using a conjunction. So remember, our conjunctions are and, or, but, etc. I love to read, but I hate going to the library. So I love to read is an independent clause. It has a verb-noun combination. And I hate going to the library is also an independent clause. It has its own verb and noun combination. And when I'm putting these two together with a conjunction, but, then we need to use a comma. I love to read, but I hate going to the library. However, you don't need to use a comma when the two clauses share the same subject. So, I love to read, but hate going to the library. If you notice, that's actually the more correct way of doing it, because I'm sharing the subject. I love to read but hate going to the library. In the previous example, if we would have used something different than I in the second independent clause, for example, I love to read but my mom hates going to the library, or but my friends hate going to the library, or but my dog hates going to the library, then it would have been perfect. Okay? So if we're sharing the subject between both clauses, then we don't need a comma and we don't need a comma before the conjunction. If we are changing the subject, that is when we need a comma before the conjunction between two independent clauses. The next time we use commas are for restrictive or non-restrictive modifiers. So a restrictive modifier is a word or phrase that modifies a noun and is essential to the meaning of the sentence. And when that is the case with a restrictive modifier, we do not use a comma. For example, the album was very good. A non-restrictive modifier, information that is not essential to convey the basic meaning of the sentence, we'd need to use not only one comma, but a pair of commas. For example, the album featuring Jennifer Lopez was very good. Okay, so a non-restrictive modifier is that information that is not essential to the basic meaning of the sentence. So the basic meaning was the album was very good, but we're adding information, so we use a pair of commas to separate that extra information from the rest of the sentence. We also use commas to separate two or more adjectives before a noun. The movie is an unusual, horrifying example of online bullying. So we have unusual and horrifying, two adjectives before the noun, so we separate those with a comma. Another critical place that we need to use commas is when we introduce a quotation. My instructor said we should usually use a comma to introduce a quotation. Okay, so when we're using a direct quotation, we often will introduce that quotation with a comma. However, if the quotation is part of the sentence grammatically, you don't need to use a comma. For example, my instructor said that we should usually use a comma to introduce a quotation. Okay, so I have my instructor said that replaces the comma. So an incorrect version would be my instructor said that, comma, we should usually use a comma to introduce a question, or a quotation, sorry. So we don't need a comma after that. Another time when we use commas is dates and places. Place a comma after the day and before the year in the month, day, year style of writing dates. So August 19th, 2014. So we don't have a comma after the month, but we have a comma after the day. So between the day and the year. We also use a comma to separate the city from a state or the state from the country. For example, Salt Lake City, comma, Utah, or Utah, comma, USA. The final place that we use commas is what are called elliptical constructions. So it's when we use a comma to show the omission of a word where the meaning can be inferred quite easily. For example, Susan bought 10 books. Henry, comma, 2. So the comma after Henry shows the omission of the word bought, because it can be inferred that since Susan bought 10 books, Henry is also buying 2, right? Susan bought 10 books, Henry, comma, 2. Now on to the biggest mistake that students make in their use of commas. And that would be what's called a comma splice. A comma splice is when only a comma is used to separate two independent clauses. So before, remember, we said if we have two independent clauses, we need a comma and a conjunction. Lots of students like to use a comma without a conjunction. For example, try not to forget to take the muffins out of the oven when they are done. The timer should go off in a few minutes. Okay, so we have two independent clauses separated by nothing but a comma. And that is a comma splice. Another thing students do too often is what's called a fused sentence, and that is when you combine two independent clauses without any punctuation. Try not to forget to take the muffins out of the oven. When they are done, the timer should go off in a few minutes. Okay, so we have two completely independent clauses separated with no punctuation. We fused those together. So let's look at some possible solutions of both of these. First, we could use a period to create two separate sentences out of the two independent clauses. For example, Try not to forget to take the muffins out of the oven when they are done. Period. The timer should go off in a few minutes. Something else we could do is to use a semicolon to connect two closely related independent clauses. So try not to forget to take the muffins out of the oven when they are done, semicolon. The top should be golden brown. Okay, so when they are done is very closely related to the idea of the tops of the muffins being golden brown, so we can use a semicolon. So we're getting away from the muffins theme now. I'm just talking about solutions of fixing comma splices or fused sentences. The next way is to use a colon to show a strong explanatory or sequential relationship between the two independent clauses. For example, I had to make an impossible decision, colon. Do I obey God or the government? The final thing we can do is use a coordinating conjunction. Again, we use a comma, or we place a comma before the coordinating conjunction. I am starving, comma, so I think I'll order pizza. Okay, so that gives you a basic crash course on commas and on the two most common mistakes that students make in their use of commas, and with some basic solutions of how to fix those. So when you're rereading or revising your papers, look for places where you've used two independent clauses and separated them only by a comma, which is a comma splice, or when you've fused multiple independent clauses together with no punctuation, and use these solutions to fix that. Okay, so if you have any questions about commas, please let me know, and I'll try to clear those up for you. And that's it for our first lecture on your punctuation crash course. Welcome back. Let's keep this crash course going. Today we're going to talk all about apostrophes. Let's begin by talking about the uses. There are three main uses of an apostrophe. We use apostrophes for omission, possession, and for some plurals. So let's talk about each of these in detail. First, omission. We use omission or an apostrophe to show the omission of letters. The most common use of this form of omission is in contractions. So instead of it is, we use its, it apostrophe s. Instead of they are, we use their. And instead of you are, we use your. We also use an apostrophe to omit letters when we're writing in some type of speech dialect. You'll see this in lots of fiction writing. So instead of coming, we would say comin'. Or instead of good old, we would say good ol'. Right? So not rocket science by any means, but we use apostrophes to omit certain letters when we're contracting words or when we're writing in a dialect. The most common use of apostrophe is to show possession. So to show possession for most singular and plural nouns that do not end with an S, we add an apostrophe and an S. For example, the women's room. Women apostrophe S. The man's favorite car. This is Mike's crash course on college writing. Okay, so simple possession of singular and plural nouns that do not already end in an S, we add an apostrophe and then an S. So what about when we have joint possession? So if something belongs to more than one person, we add an apostrophe S only after the last person's name. For example, that is Bert and Ernie's favorite food. Notice that the apostrophe S comes after Ernie, the second name, and not after both of them. However, if Bert and Ernie own separate but similar objects, and they are listed together, then we do place an S after each name. So those are Bert's and Ernie's favorite colors. So each has a different favorite color, so we would use Bert's and Ernie's. Okay, so we use an apostrophe S on both names if they are owning separate but similar objects. Here's where lots of the confusion comes in, is when nouns are already end in S. So we do add an apostrophe S after singular nouns that end in S. For example, that is my boss's car. So boss already ends in S, but it is singular, so we do add an apostrophe S. This is Mr. Ross's class. However, we add an apostrophe after the final S of plurals ending in S. So we don't add an extra S if the plural is already ending in S. We just add an apostrophe. Those are my two daughters' skirts. So the plural, daughters, already ends in S, so we just add the apostrophe. Are these toys the kids from daycare? So kids already adds an S, it is a plural, so we only add the apostrophe. Let's look at common places where students love to place apostrophes, but they are wrong. So the first one is to make plurals of words, letters, and symbols used as nouns. So incorrect is twos and threes with an apostrophe. Correct would be twos and threes without an apostrophe. Another one, do's and don'ts with apostrophes. The correct form is do's and don'ts without apostrophes before the S. Another one is to create plurals out of capital letters and abbreviations without internal punctuation. So my transcript shows 4 A's, 3 B's, and 2 C's. The correct way to write that is without apostrophes. My transcript shows 4 A's, 3 B's, and 2 C's. And for abbreviations without internal punctuation, we also do not use an apostrophe. So I earned 2 PhDs from Harvard. Correct would be I earned 2 PhDs without the apostrophe from Harvard. We do the same thing for a time period. Lots of us like to put an apostrophe when we're showing a time period, but that is false. We don't need or we shouldn't use apostrophes with time periods. So incorrect would be the 1960 apostrophe S. Correct is the 1960s without an apostrophe. We also never use an apostrophe to create possessive nouns or possessive pronouns. We do for nouns, not for pronouns. So incorrect would be yours, apostrophe S, and the correct is yours without an apostrophe. And finally, we never use apostrophes to pluralize normal or regular nouns. So there are a lot of kids in the park. Of course, the correct form of that is simply without the apostrophe. Okay? So send me any questions you have about apostrophes, but my main tip is not to make it more difficult than it actually is. So the only things apostrophes actually do are to show omission of letters within a word or to show possession. But still, if you're struggling with this, if you notice you're unsure of when to use an apostrophe, please shoot me an email and we'll chat about it. All right, thanks. Today we're moving on with our punctuation crash course to discuss the use of colon, semicolon, hyphen, and dash. Let's begin with the basics of a colon. The colon must follow a complete sentence and is always followed by an explanation or a list. For example, the teacher gave the class a seemingly impossible assignment. Change the world in 3 days or less. So it follows a complete sentence and it adds explanation. Another one. There are 3 key characteristics of good academic writing: an arguable thesis, paragraph unity, and concision. So here we have a complete sentence followed by a list after the colon. And those are the 2 most basic uses of the colon. The next is the semicolon. The semicolon is used to join 2 closely related independent clauses without a coordinating conjunction. So remember, those are and, but, or yet. An example, the team's luck was finally turning around. They had won 4 games in a row. So these 2, luck turning around and winning 4 games in a row, are very closely related. So we can add a semicolon and put these 2 sentences or independent clauses together. A semicolon also is used to combine 2 independent clauses with a conjunctive adverb. So, the team's luck was finally turning around. Unfortunately, the captain broke his arm in the last game. So here we have 2 independent clauses, and we have a conjunctive adverb, unfortunately. So we use a semicolon, the conjunctive adverb, and then a comma. And then we combine those 2 independent clauses. A semicolon is also used to separate items within a list that have internal punctuation. So let's look at an example. I recently read a book about 3 wizards: Harry Potter, Quidditch seeker; Ronald Weasley, loyal friend; and Hermione Granger, Ron's girlfriend. Okay, so within this list we have commas because we're using non-restrictive modifiers. Remember, Harry Potter, we're adding information; Quidditch seeker, so we use a comma. But since each item in this list has internal punctuation, since each has a comma, we use a semicolon to separate the items within the list. Finally, a semicolon is also used to link two independent clauses connected by a coordinating conjunction if the clause or the clauses have internal punctuation. So, I love bacon, sausage, and eggs, but I hate pancakes. So the first independent clause has internal punctuation. It has multiple commas already. So then we use a semicolon before the coordinating conjunction but to connect that second independent clause. Okay? What about the hyphen? The hyphen is first or most commonly used to make compound words. For example, 46 or son-in-law. It also connects prefixes and suffixes to main words, like anti-abortion or pro-Canadian. Not all compound words, however, are connected by a hyphen, so don't get mixed up. We have words like baseball and bathroom. We have plenty of compound words that do not use a hyphen. Also, not all prefixes and suffixes are connected with a hyphen. Examples like premature or coworker. So if you're not sure, it's best to just always check the dictionary. And finally, let's turn to the dash. There are different types of dashes. There's an end dash, which is longer than the hyphen, and this is used with number ranges or after a number to show a continuation. And there is no space between an end dash and the number. For example, 2012 to 2014, we use an end dash, not a hyphen. Utah beat Chicago 104 to 103. It's two sets of numbers. We do not use a hyphen. We use an end dash. And Frank Herdman, 1974, end dash, meaning he is still alive. Continuation. We also use the end dash to make compound adjectives out of compound words. So if there's a compound word already using a hyphen, and we're wanting to make a compound adjective, then we need to use an end dash between the compound word and the next word. For example, a 22-page research paper. So 22 is already a compound word connected by a hyphen. Then we use an end dash to connect that compound word to the word page to make what's called a compound adjective. The other type of dash is an em dash, and it's the longest horizontal punctuation line. So it shows an abrupt shift in emphasis or direction. For example, drinking milk has never killed anyone yet. So em dash is long dash yet, because it's showing an abrupt shift or an emphasis. We also can use this instead of parentheses to add extra information into a sentence. For example, America's greatest writers, Twain, Poe, and Melville, all wrote throughout the 19th century. Okay, and depending on which word processor you're using, there are different ways of making the N or the M dash. So quickly Google it according to whatever word processor you're using to figure it out. Okay, and that's it today for our punctuation crash course on colons, semicolons, hyphens, and dashes. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Today, as we move on with our punctuation crash course, we'll be talking about quotations and citations, or how to punctuate quotations and citations. So let's look first at quotation marks. We're going to talk about when and how to use quotation marks. The first is the most obvious, when we use direct quotations. So whenever we use direct quotations, we use quotation marks around words or phrases taken directly from another source. For example, Dr. Taylor argues that writing is the most effective way to learn to think critically. However, we do not use quotation marks when we paraphrase or summarize someone else's ideas. We still have to cite or show our source, but we don't use quotation marks unless we're using a direct quotation. What about block quotations? So block quotations are usually when we have 4 or more lines of directly quoted material. We put it in a block. When we do a block quotation, though, we do not use quotation marks. Another time we do use quotation marks is when we use unusual words. For example, nicknames. Growing up, they called me Tenderfoot Taylor. So an unusual word. We also use quotation marks when we are implying irony. For example, his evidence was not substantial enough to present in court. So the ironic term evidence, meaning the evidence wasn't very good. Another instance where we use quotation marks is when we use a word as a word. Sounds kind of funny, but look at the example. Try to avoid using very often as a modifier. So very, we're using the word as a word. And another time to use quotation marks is when we write out the titles of minor works. So short stories, essays, poems, songs, magazine articles, newspaper articles, speeches, and chapters of books. This is something many students mess up on continually. So minor works use quotation marks, and major works, such as books or epic poems, movies, magazines, and so on, those are italicized, okay? Now let's talk about the other punctuation marks that we need to use together with our quotation marks. For example, commas and periods. Commas and periods always go on the inside of the quotation marks. Example, research shows that smartphones are making teenagers dumber. Okay? If you have a citation, so the name, the page number, in parentheses after the quotation marks, then we put the comma or period all the way on the end of the citation. When there's no citation present, however, then the period or the comma goes inside of the quotation marks. Colons and semicolons, on the other hand, go outside of the quotation marks, except for when they are part of the original quotation. So an example would be, there are a number of problems with his work. Above all, it is sloppy. So that semicolon is not a part of the original quotation, work, so it goes on the outside of the quotation marks. Likewise, question marks, exclamation points, and dashes all go outside of the quotation marks, again, unless they are part of the original quotation. So we'll look at a few examples here. When I asked if I could get a drink, Rex yelled, "Forget about it." So there, the exclamation point is part of the original quotation. He was yelling, so it's part of it, so it goes on the inside. In this next example, the punctuation mark is not part of the original quotation, and will therefore go on the outside of the quotation marks. What did your mom mean when she said, "Remember who you are and what you stand for"? So the question mark is not part of the original quotation and therefore goes outside of the quotation marks. What about when we need to use quotation marks within a direct quotation? So a quotation within a quotation uses single quotation marks. For example, Taylor argues, as Luther states, the law must be obeyed. He is speaking of the spirit, not the letter of the law. So here, you are quoting from Taylor, but Taylor is quoting from Luther. So, there's a quotation within a quotation, and that one receives single quotation marks. And now, as I already mentioned before, with parenthetical citations. So in MLA and APA citation styles, the period goes after the parentheses. So here's an MLA example. He replied, "Whatever I feel like I want to do. Gosh." And then the period goes at the end. So dynamite, 74, parentheses, period. An APA example. Dynamite, 2004, replied, "Whatever I feel like I want to do. Gosh." And then we have the page number, and after the closing parentheses is where we put our period. The final very important punctuation mark when we use quotations or citations is the ellipsis. The ellipsis is used to show an omission from the original quotation. One thing to remember though is when we do an ellipsis, it's not simply the triple dot, period, period, period. We actually need a space in between each period. For example, he replied, "Whatever I want to do. Gosh." So we took part of that quotation out, and we filled that in with an ellipsis, period, space, period, space, period, space, and then we continue with the quotation. Okay, and that's it for punctuating quotations and citations. I know this was a lot to cram into one lecture, but it'll be a good resource for you to come back to. And again, as always, if you have questions, let me know. And the crash course continues. Today we are talking all about capitalization. So let's begin. The first thing we capitalize always are proper nouns, so specific persons, places, or things. Example, Mike Taylor rented an Audi on his vacation in Hawaii. So here we have Mike Taylor, proper noun. We have Audi, another proper noun, and Hawaii, a third proper noun, all capitalized. We also capitalize titles when those titles are part of a person's name. So let's look at two sentences to show the difference. Yesterday I went to the doctor. The doctor is not a part of anyone's name, it's just simply the title, so we don't capitalize it in that sense. However, the next sentence, yesterday I went to Dr. Jones, it is part of the person's name and we do capitalize it. We also capitalize specific institutions, and we capitalize the complete name of that institution. So for example, I will be attending Harvard University next year, so we capitalize both Harvard and university. Speaking of universities, we also capitalize specific courses. So we capitalize the course names, but not the general subjects. So again, two examples to show the difference. I love math. Math is not capitalized. Or I love Math 101. That's the name of a specific course, so we do capitalize math. We also capitalize calendar events or time periods. So days of the week, months, and holidays are all capitalized, but we don't capitalize seasons. So we always have a picnic on the first Saturday of spring. Saturday is a day of the week, so it is capitalized. Spring is a season, so it is not capitalized. We also capitalize brand names. Just specific brands though, not just general products. So my favorite brand of jeans is Levi's. So jeans would be a general product, so we don't capitalize jeans, but Levi's is a specific brand name, and so we capitalize Levi's. Another main category that we capitalize are kinship names. So we capitalize names like mother, father, uncle, etc., but only when those come directly before a proper name or when those are taking the place of someone's proper name. You don't capitalize aunt, for example, if you're not referring to a specific relative, or when the kinship name follows a pronoun. For example, Dad told me to visit Grandma and Aunt Jane before going to my uncle's house. So here we have Grandma and Aunt Jane. Grandma is taking place of her proper name, so it gets capitalized. Aunt Jane, aunt is preceding a proper name, so it gets capitalized. And then my uncle's house, I'm just talking about my uncle, it's not replacing a proper name per se, so uncle does not get capitalized. We also need to remember to always capitalize cities, states, countries, regions, and other locations with proper names. We don't capitalize directions like north, south, east, and west, but we do capitalize these, like I said, cities, states, countries, and so on. Example would be, I live just north of Columbus, Ohio in the Midwest. North is not capitalized. Columbus, a city name, capitalized. Ohio, a state name, capitalized. Midwest, the name of a specific region, so it also is capitalized. The final category of capitalization is for nationalities and languages, so we always capitalize nationalities or languages. Let's look at this example. Although his parents are both French, he can only speak English. So French is a nationality, capitalized, and English is the language that he speaks, so it is also capitalized. Finally, this is not a category, but something we need to remember, that just like at the beginning of a sentence, we always capitalize the first letter of the first word at the beginning of a sentence. We also capitalize the first letter of a quotation when it is set off from the rest of the sentence with a punctuation mark, and it is its own independent clause. So, for example, an incorrect example would be the man yelled, "Get out of my way!" So get out of my way is its own independent clause. The quotation is separated with a punctuation mark, so the G in get needs to be capitalized, and we see that in the correct example. Another way of writing this correctly would be to not separate it with a punctuation mark, and then we don't have to capitalize the G in get. So here we have, the man yelled that I should get out of his way. So if you see that bracket in there, and remember from our discussion about quotations, brackets are to change or to add things to the original quotation. But here there's no punctuation to separate the quotation from the other part of the sentence, so the first letter does not need to be capitalized. And I know this was a quick run through of categories of capitalization, but it's very basic. It's mostly memorizing what needs to be capitalized and what doesn't. If you can memorize these categories that I've provided today, you're on the right path. And if you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, turn back to this whenever you need it. Use it as a resource to remind yourself what needs to be and what does not need to be capitalized. Hello again, and welcome to Section 5, entitled Common College Writing Assignments. This is a section that I think many of you will find very useful. It's one I'm also especially excited about. It's where I'm going to walk you through some key strategies and ideas of how to write some of the most common college writing assignments effectively. So today we'll begin with the opinion editorial, or the op-ed. First, as always, let's go ahead and talk about the purpose. The purpose of an op-ed or an opinion editorial is to persuade your audience to agree with your claims and then to act on a specific issue. So today I'm going to walk you through first some pre-writing ideas and then each part of the actual paper and give some strategies, talk a little bit about each part of the opinion editorial, the op-ed paper, so the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. But first, the first thing we need to do is to choose a topic. We do this obviously in our pre-writing stage of the writing process. So when we're pre-writing, we need to think first of what topics are relevant in your current life. It's very important to remain current. And I'll talk about this, or I'll remind you of this again at the end, but it's also a useful idea to choose current topics that can also be read as controversial. So controversial topics make very good op-ed pieces because your readers will have an immediate response. Once you've identified topics that you think are relevant in your personal current life, start to connect your personal interests and do some background, just basic background research to make sure you're both informed and passionate about the topic. So being informed is not enough, and being only passionate is not enough. We need to make sure we're both informed and passionate about the topic we're writing on. The second thing we need to do in our pre-writing is to identify the audience. So who is your specific audience? What are the general opinions, beliefs, and values of your audience? How might your audience take a stance on the issue, and how come? And what new information or ideas are you going to offer to those members who already agree with you? So in other words, in order to carve out your own angle and to be able to present your opinion in a persuasive way, you need to identify your audience early on, at least the audience, your target audience, in order to decide which types of examples, which type of rhetoric, which level of diction, and so on to use in order to be most persuasive. Once we've done our pre-writing, we've answered these questions for ourselves, and we've written down a few ideas, or we've drawn a mind map to start to draw those connections that we'll discuss in detail in our paper. We then need to come up with our thesis. As we develop our thesis, it's important to first remember that a really good opinion editorial is not simply an emotional rant. You see these all over the internet these days, of simple emotional rants about controversial topics. That is not an effective opinion editorial. An effective opinion editorial strikes a balance between emotion, logic, and the effective appealing to authority. So as you're selecting a topic to write on, make sure that it is a topic that you'll be able to apply a balance to. That you're not only overly emotional about, or that you're not simply thinking logically about, but something that you can tap into each of these three elements of rhetoric. Remember also that just like any other piece of writing, it's important to select a narrow topic and a topic where you're going to be able to assert a certain claim. As you develop your thesis, also remember that you want to write a thesis that people will disagree with. Right? Of course, you want to persuade people to agree with you, but your thesis should invite counter-arguments. It should invite disagreement. Remember, this is your opinion, not a fact. So you want people to both agree and disagree. So as you think about this, you should think of the possible objections to your thesis. If you can think of a number of good counter-arguments, that means you're on the right track. That means you have a good thesis. So questions to ask yourself as well as you're developing your thesis are things like, does the issue have at least two sides? And is my stance on the issue clear? Once you've constructed your thesis, and again, as always, I'm happy to take a look at your thesis for you before you even begin to write your paper. But once you finish your thesis and you've done your introduction, we move on to the body. For the body of an opinion editorial, remember opinion editorials are typically quite short, quite brief, and to the point. You should identify 3 or 4 main reasons why your audience should agree with your thesis. You should state each of these reasons as the topic sentence of each of your body paragraphs. So each body paragraph should discuss only one of those 3 or 4 reasons. And remember that each body paragraph needs to give evidence that supports your original thesis. And within opinion editorials, it's also important to remember that you can and even should use both formal and informal research. So life anecdotes, peer surveys, as well as research into more reputable sources. So once we've created our body through 3 or 4 main paragraphs, each discussing only one main reason that our audience should agree with our thesis, so we move on to our conclusion. When we conclude an opinion editorial, it's very important that we conclude, again, of course you don't always have to do it this way, but it's quite effective to conclude again with your own commentary on the topic. And you do this by doing things like providing a personal anecdote to illustrate your personal investment in the topic. So concluding on a personal anecdote that connects with the audience and shows your own investment, and about speaking frankly about the larger politics, interpretations, concerns, and so on that have to do with the more narrow topic there at hand. And if you're looking for examples of good opinion editorials, the perfect place to look is simply at your favorite newspaper, or your favorite newspaper columnist. Take a look at how he or she introduces the topic, what topics they're choosing, how they develop their body paragraphs, and of course how they conclude. And to conclude today, let's give you some final tips. Remember, your topic should be current and controversial. Those make for the best op-ed writing topics. Remember to be concise. Again, these are short, so to the point, state your claim very early on and clearly, which is, of course, my next point. State where you stand clearly and early in your paper. Encourage the action that your opinion should invoke. This is also a great thing to do in your conclusion, is to encourage some sort of action, invite your audience to take action. And that's it. So in my opinion, opinion editorials are some of the most fun writing you'll be able to do in college. But we also don't receive a lot of training on how to write an effective opinion editorial. So I hope today helps in that regard. If you do have any questions, of course, let me know. And I look forward to our next lecture on literary or textual analysis. Hello again. As we move on with our common college essay types, today we'll be talking about rhetorical analysis. So the purpose of a rhetorical analysis assignment is for you to identify and analyze the rhetorical tools used by the author. You should also describe how the author's rhetoric is or is not effective or persuasive, and identify strengths and flaws in the argument. This is a very popular type of assignment. You'll find this type of assignment on graduate exams. For example, the GRE uses this type of assignment. So let me walk you through the basics of how to approach a rhetorical analysis type of assignment. We need to ask ourselves a number of questions, and I've organized these questions into the 3 basic tenets of rhetoric, namely logic or logos, emotion or pathos, and authority or ethos. So under logic, we have how selective is the logic of the argument? So the idea of selective versus objective. If the author is being very selective in their logic, that is a point to write down in the pre-writing to make some notes. Can you already identify any logical fallacies? And does the fallacy weaken or strengthen the argument? Under emotion, we have what emotion does the speaker highlight and why? How is the speaker appealing or attempting to manipulate the audience's emotions? And how does the speaker connect the invoked emotion to the purpose of the overall argument? And then with authority, ask yourself the following questions. What authority does the speaker hope you will trust? The speaker or an outside reputable source? Will the audience accept this authority? Why or why not? And does trusting this authority persuade the audience to trust the speaker? So you notice with pre-writing in this type of assignment, different than the assignment we discussed in the very beginning of our lecture series in our pre-writing practice then. Pre-writing in this type of assignment is to ask yourself key questions like these and then to take notes. From the notes, you'll then be able to outline. As always, after we've outlined, we move on to our drafting stage. With rhetorical analysis, we have the same parts of a paper as we do with almost any writing, which is an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. So as we draft the introduction, we need to first address the text's context. So why and where is this argument taking place? Who is the speaker? Who is the specified audience? And what is the speaker working to convince the audience of? And then let me give you a thesis template for rhetorical analysis. Of course, you can personalize this, and you should personalize this depending on your individual assignment and your individual argument. But here is a good template. In this piece of writing, so whatever you're looking at, the author, so the author's name, uses these tools to effectively or ineffectively persuade the audience that, and then the speaker's argument. Okay, this is a very prescriptive thesis template. I don't usually like to give prescriptive tools to writers because writing is an individual exercise. However, as I promised at the very beginning of our course, writing is also a science. And there's a science to rhetorical analysis, and this thesis template is a good formula for a beginning thesis for any rhetorical analysis assignment. If you're struggling to come up with a thesis for a rhetorical analysis assignment, as always, send it to me and I'll have a look for you. But with the drafting stage, we move on to the body. Remember in the body to begin each paragraph with a topic sentence that addresses the question, how does this tool, so fill in the blank with whatever rhetorical tool you're identifying, help the speaker achieve his purpose? It's also good to provide a quotation and explain why it is a good example of the rhetorical tool you have described. The best part, though, is not only to provide the quotation, but then to analyze the quotation. Remember, when we use quotations, we need more analysis than we do quotations. So our personal analysis is more important than the quotation itself. So when you analyze the quotation, ask yourself questions like, what effect does the tool have on the audience? What does this effect have to do with the speaker's overall argument? And remember, there's a difference between appeals, so rhetorical appeals, and rhetorical tools like humor, metaphors, statistics, and so on. And then we move on to our conclusion. In your conclusion, briefly summarize your main points to echo your thesis. Again, whenever I say the word summarize, don't say the same thing in the same terms that you've already done in your paper. That's just boring and repetitive. But summarize your main points in a new way. Also address what you are claiming about the author's rhetoric and what implications your claims have. And just like any writing assignment, we move to our final step in the writing process, the revision process. Remember to go large to small. So make sure you are analyzing, not just summarizing and stating the effectiveness or ineffectiveness. Do not choose word choice as a rhetorical tool. You need to be more specific. For example, words of power and monarchy, or words of submission and defeat. So don't say the author uses word choice. Describe that word choice. Refer to pathos, ethos, and logos correctly, remembering that these are rhetorical appeals and not tools. Also in your revision, check that you've spent adequate time on each rhetorical tool so that you've done adequate analysis of each. Don't stretch and contrive the uses and effect of the tool, but make sure you analyze each tool adequately. A warning is also not to focus too much on the circumstances of the original audience. You don't necessarily know how this text was received by the original audience, even if you have a few evidences of a couple of audience members. So don't try to guess how it was received. Your job is rather to analyze the speech itself, so the words and the language, not to analyze the speaker or the audience. And finally, a final warning with rhetorical analysis assignments: never make moral or circumstantial judgments. So just because an action took place does not mean that the rhetoric itself was effective. And just because you agree morally with an argument does not mean the rhetoric was effective. So remember, rhetorical analysis is all about analyzing the language, the words and the language of a certain text. Today we're moving on to our next common college writing assignment, which is the literary or the textual analysis. This is one that I've found gives students the most anxiety. It's often the type of paper assigned in first and second year English courses, and also the type of assignment that I have the most experience with, being a PhD candidate in English, focusing on literature. So it's of course my favorite type of writing assignment. However, I understand that it is often presented to the students in a very vague or ambiguous way, and I hope that I can break through that today and give you some really concrete ideas or strategies of how to write a good literary analysis at the college level. Let's begin, as always, with the purpose of a literary analysis. So the purpose is to reveal something about the text that is not automatically evident to a casual reader. This is very important. Lots of times when we do literary analysis, students simply paraphrase or summarize the plot of a literary text. That is not the goal. The goal, again, is not to show comprehension, but rather to show engagement. So your goal or the purpose of a good literary analysis is to reveal something new, something about the text that is not automatically evident. This does not mean, however, that we simply apply some now canonical theory, such as Marxism, feminism, post-structuralism, etc. So rather than turning to a text and saying, I'm going to do a Marxist reading of The Hobbit, you should ask fundamental questions about the text, and then allow theoretical methodologies such as Marxism, feminism, post-structuralism, and so on to inform and further your questions. So your goal within a literary analysis is not to focus on a theory, but rather focus on the literature, and to use theory when assigned, of course. So don't guess at theory if you're not already familiar with it and you're not assigned to research that theory. But if you are using theory, remember the focus is on the literature and not on the theory. So theory is there to influence and to shift our reading or our perspective as we read a literary text. So I'm going to walk you through the basic parts of a paper, beginning with the thesis. And this time I'm going to give you some simple do's and do nots, some do's and don'ts about how to write a good thesis for a literary analysis paper. First, do not simply identify literary elements, themes, or ideas. Okay, so don't simply say, I'm going to talk about the setting. You can, of course, talk about the setting and have a whole paper about the setting of a certain literary text. However, we need it much more narrow, right? Narrow in on something very specific about the setting if that's the goal. So your goal is not to simply identify literary elements, themes, or ideas. What you should do is make assertions about these elements. So how do they work together to inform your own reading or perspective? It is also important to present a debatable perspective on the literature. So much like the op-ed paper that we talked about in a previous lecture, how a controversial idea makes a good topic for an opinion editorial, a perspective that is debatable, in other words, that others can disagree with, is the goal. So you should present a debatable perspective on the literature. And perhaps most importantly is you need to always consider the so what. And let me talk you through the process of identifying how to write or how to identify the so what, or why does this matter? Who cares, right? So first you need to identify the general story or message of the text, if it has one. Identify the general theme or themes and sub-themes, and choose one of the general themes or sub-themes to focus on. Second, how is the chosen theme communicated? Or what is unique about the text's portrayal of the theme? This should begin to raise deeper theoretical and social questions. So you can ask yourself questions like, are there tensions between ideologies, races, religions, classes, genders, etc.? Identify these tensions and identify certain elements of language used to discuss the tensions within the text, such as dialogue, settings, symbols, motifs, metaphors, etc. Third, how does your selected theme and the author's presentation of that theme engage with others' discussions of that theme? And finally, what does your assertion or perspective add to the discussion of this theme and the text's contribution to a fuller exploration of the theme? So remember, your goal is to present a debatable perspective and to make assertions, new assertions that are going to cause me to read the text in a new and interesting way. And these are the types of things you need to consider while writing a literary analysis thesis. So we need the what, which is where you're going to identify specific elements and make assertions about those elements, and the so what, the why does it matter? What is the larger debatable issue that your reading of that literature is contributing to? And once we have our thesis, we've outlined accordingly. I'm not going to talk through outlining today, but outlining is the same in almost any paper, right? But we'll move on to our drafting and begin with our introduction. In our introduction to a literary analysis paper, we should focus immediately on your subject and do so by getting your readers' interest by using, for example, a quotation, posing a provocative question, telling a brief anecdote, or announcing a startling statement. Remember, you don't have to limit yourself to just one of these things. You can always use a combination of any of these ideas as introductory strategies to, again, focus on your subject immediately and get your readers' interest and attention. So now moving on to the body. Remember that we need to begin each paragraph with a topic sentence, just like in any writing assignment. But in this one, we need to state one of the topics related to your thesis and make an assertion about how the topic supports the central argument or idea. And then within each paragraph, explain your ideas using evidence from the literary text. That evidence can be in the form of summary, paraphrase, identifying very specific details, and direct quotations. A few warnings about paragraphs, or the substance of your paragraphs. First, each paragraph, I've said this before, but I'll repeat it because it's very important, should only discuss a single topic, right? Each paragraph should be dedicated to one topic. If you are going to summarize, never summarize too much. Literary analysis is not plot summary, but it is necessary sometimes to summarize a bit in order to get to your point. But the goal is to use as specific and detailed evidence as you can, and then to spend the majority of your time interpreting and analyzing and digging deeper into those details or those pieces of evidence. And then we move on to our conclusion. In the conclusion, we need to give a sense of completeness. And I have here a couple of strategies of how to do that. We can first restate the thesis in different words. We can summarize our main points. And we can suggest reading the literature through a different perspective. It is absolutely vital that we do not introduce a new topic in our conclusion. So the conclusion is no time, I've discussed this before, but it is no time of introducing new ideas. Rather, it's a time to restate our thesis, summarize our main points, and go out with a bang that makes our reader continue to think about the literary text under analysis through a new perspective, a new lens. And that's really it. So a couple of reminders. First, remember that you need to focus as much as possible on the literature itself. Dig deep into that literature, find details, find quotations, find moments that you can draw meaning from, and then interpret those moments in order to find those tensions in ideologies, right? In race, in gender, in sexuality, and so on. And allow yourself to explore those ideas rather than simply summarizing. Make claims. Literary analysis is, in a way, an opinion editorial. However, it is an opinion that is firmly supported by evidence within the literature itself. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions. I love this form of writing, and so I look forward to. Alright, welcome back. Today we are moving on to another common college writing assignment, which is the research paper. A research paper is usually going to be your most lengthy writing assignment that you'll have to do at the university. But it can also be one of the most rewarding because it allows the most individual exploration of topics that interest us, right? But because so much of it relies on outside sources, it is important to look at some key strategies of how to find a good topic, what to do when we're reading sources in order to do it effectively and efficiently, and then how to build the paper. So we'll begin by talking about different types of research papers and what's expected. Of course, these shift from professor to professor, so don't take these as the authority, of course. Always follow the exact instructions given to you by your individual professors. However, these are some of the general expectations of research papers in the various fields. First, we have the humanities, which is to use outside sources to support your own original argumentative thesis. In the social sciences, we have two different types of research. We have primary research, which is where you showcase your own data and information. And then there's secondary research, where you analyze and evaluate the research of other experts. Within the natural and biological sciences, we have two different types of common research papers. First is the informative, which is to present others' findings or explain a scientific process. And then there's also the argumentative, which is to use the findings of others to create your own argument. And what we're going to talk about today applies, at least in some degree, to each of these various research paper types or research paper assignment types. So the strategies that I'll share with you today will be useful to write a successful research paper in any of these fields. And the first thing we need to discuss is topic. It is very important to identify first an interesting, but also a narrow topic. The general rule, if you think the topic is boring, your reader will even more so. So find a topic that interests you. To do that, it's helpful to first do some initial background research. So basic research often uncovers new potential topics. So don't go out and read full books or even full articles. Simply browse common databases, even things like Wikipedia, to get a basic idea of what research has been done, what the common knowledge is, and then you'll be able to begin to identify new potential topics or subtopics to contribute or to broaden that common knowledge base. It's important to be specific. Never try to cover too broad of an issue. This is a very common problem in student research writing, is that students try to take on such a huge issue. Remember the general rule again, depth rather than breadth, right? We're looking for depth. A way we can make sure we're being specific enough is to begin with the broad issue of interest, and then to break that broader issue into subtopics, and then to choose from those subtopics which one you think is most interesting, which one strikes you, which one you want to learn more about. Remember, a research paper should be guided by your own desire to learn something more, to discover something new, and that desire should be reflected in first your topic and then in your actual writing of the paper. Finally, look at the specific topic from a different perspective to discover other possible approaches to the topic. So force yourself to think of different ways of thinking about the topic that you've chosen or that smaller subtopic that you've chosen, and consider whether or not a different perspective or a different approach would be more appropriate, more interesting, and more persuasive. Once you've identified your topic or your subtopic, it is now time to do some research. But there are some key tips or strategies of doing research to save you a lot of time. Research can turn into a never-ending process if we are not careful. So there are two main sources that we turn to for academic research. One is journal articles, so academic journals. The best way to find the essential articles for your topic is to first skim through the titles, of course, for the titles that stand out to you as being relevant. Read the abstracts. Most journals will publish the abstracts within the database online. The abstract will describe the basic claims and methodology of the paper. Of those abstracts that you find to be relevant or interesting, pull out the full article and read the introduction and identify the thesis statement. If those continue to be relevant and interesting, then read the full article. So only read the full article if it is directly related to your topic, or if you simply find it extremely interesting. So it's also important, don't only narrow your research to your very, very specific topic, especially early on, because if you find other interesting articles, your topic may shift in very productive ways. So there should be a little bit of flexibility. The other source is books, right? Academic books. The best way to filter through the thousands and thousands of books that are going to come up in a library, a general library search of the topic, is to read book reviews. So book reviews are much like the abstract of journal articles. They're from other renowned scholars in the field who summarize the basic claims and the contributions of the book. After you've done that and you've identified books that will be useful for you, like the journal articles, read the introductions and then read the conclusions. If it continues to be of interest to you and seems to be useful, then go through the table of contents and identify the specific chapters that are related to your specific topic. So you'll read the introduction, the conclusion, and the specific chapters related to your topic. You'll seldom have to read an entire academic book for a research paper. And while you're doing all of this research, Once you've found the ones that you are interested in reading the full article or the full chapters, it's important to take notes. This really saves time in the long run. And here are some ideas of what to include in those notes. First is the bibliographic information. So the things that you'll need to be able to find that original source again. We often have to leave our research and come back to it, so the bibliographic information is absolutely vital. Under that, you should also quickly summarize the main argument or the topic. If you find in your reading any pertinent quotations, so really key quotations, put those in your notes. And last but not least, very important, write down your own thoughts, reactions, or ideas for incorporating in your paper. And make sure to write those down immediately. Lots of times we forget, we think we'll remember that idea we had in relation to the reading. And then we go back to begin writing, we don't remember, right? So write down those immediate reactions and thoughts, because it's likely that you won't have time to go back and reread the entire chapter or reread the entire article. From there, once we've seen what's out there in the field, we've found our topic and we've revised our topic according to some of the research that we found, we then develop our thesis. And a thesis for a research paper is very similar to the other thesis statements we've talked about, in that you need to assert a claim that provides a new insight or perspective. It's important, though, not to simply develop a thesis out of the research that you've found. So don't simply copy a thesis or combine a number of different theses from the research that you've looked at. Instead, develop a thesis that is a reaction to what you find or what you don't find in your research. So again, thesis is proving your individual engagement with the topic. Remember to focus on the narrow topic and to announce that narrow topic within your thesis, remembering that depth is better than breadth. From the thesis, we move on to the introduction. The introduction, like other introductions, needs to arouse reader curiosity, provide necessary background information, and explain why you're writing the paper. So not because it is an assignment, but rather why your ideas that you're about to write about are going to be so significant. Remember, for more ideas of how to write a good introduction, we have that whole lecture on introductions earlier on. Moving on to the body, remember to begin each paragraph with a topic sentence that links the one topic of the paragraph back to your thesis. Make sure to use summary, paraphrase, and direct quotations from your research, making sure to cite them correctly, of course, to illustrate how your ideas engage with the larger field. And stylistically, it's important to use a variety of summary, paraphrase, and direct quotations in your research. So don't simply directly quote every single one of the ideas you're incorporating into your paper. Use a nice combination, a nice balance between the three ways of inserting others' ideas. Finally, remember that your cited sources, so these other ideas that you bring in from your research, are there to support your own ideas. They should never outweigh your ideas. Your analysis, interpretation, and exploration of your research, of the topic through your research, is what needs to be highlighted all the way throughout your paper. Now let's move on to the conclusion. Conclusion, again, like other conclusions, restate your thesis in different words, summarize your main points, explain the implications of your overall thesis by, for example, making a prediction about the future, giving advice, issuing some kind of call to action, connecting to the larger context or theme, and emphasizing the significance of how your ideas shift the common perspective, understanding, discourse, and so on. And then finally, it's time to revise. Again, remember to go large to small, beginning with unity issues, overall argument issues, and so on. And then to pay, within research papers, pay a special attention to how you have incorporated your outside sources. So have you introduced them and discussed them adequately? Remember our purpose of life strategy. Have you cited them properly? Remember to check the style guide or the citation guide assigned to you by your professor. And finally, have you relied too heavily on the sources rather than developing your own ideas? Never let the sources or the research outweigh your ideas or your engagement with the research. All right, and that's it. I would love to hear some of your research topics. I could help you identify whether they are too broad or too narrow, and I'd be happy to field some thesis statements as well. So send them on my way or post them into our forum to get some feedback from your peers and fellow students. All right, thanks. Let's move on today to another common college essay type, namely the timed essay. The timed essay is arguably one of the most common essays you'll have to write in the college experience. And it's usually also for midterms or finals, so some of your big grades are determined on timed essays. The problem, however, is that we usually receive very little instruction on how to write a timed essay effectively. We're just kind of expected to know how to do it. So today I'm going to give you some of that instruction. And as always, you feel free to ask me any questions you might have in preparation for any essays that you have coming up. So let's begin with what to do before a timed essay, before the exam. The first thing is to practice answering possible essay questions. Some professors are kind enough to give you sample essay questions or even to give you the essay questions in advance so that you have time to prepare your thoughts. Even if that is not the case, you should be able to think of, especially through past experiences or asking other fellow students in a group, thinking of possible essay questions from key terms or key topics discussed throughout the course. So practice answering those possible essay questions. And you can do this with a full essay. So if you have time, you can write out a full essay. More likely, however, you would have time to do an outline and a thesis. So those are the two most important things to prepare for a timed essay, is to practice answering possible questions by coming up with a thesis in response to that possible essay question, and then outlining your ideas accordingly. Okay, and I highly, highly recommend this. Practice thesis statements and outlines will always pay off in the end. What do we do, though, once it's time for the timed essay, once it's time for the exam? The first thing is to make sure we actually understand the question or the assignment being given us. Here I've listed some of the most common terms used in timed essay questions or assignments and what exactly they mean. So I always suggest when you're doing a timed essay or a timed assignment to underline these key words in the assignment so you can look back and continue to remind yourself. Part of the battle of a good timed essay is doing exactly what the essay or what the assignment is asking you to do. Lots of us get writing and then we drift far away from what the original assignment was. So if we underline these key words, understanding, of course, what they are asking us to do, then we're already on our way to writing a good essay in direct response to the assignment. So we have compare, which means you need to discuss similarities, contrast, which is to discuss differences, criticize, which is discuss the positives and negatives, to define, which is where you need to make a claim about how something should be defined, describing characteristics that can be used to compare or contrast similar concepts. Discuss means to provide pros and cons evidence that describes strengths and weaknesses. Explain is to describe reasons for, causes of, or significance of important and difficult concepts. Illustrate means you need to really use concrete examples. Interpret is where you clarify the meaning you find in the ideas or evidence you are discussing. Justify is to describe why a judgment, behavior, or an act is rational or significant. And finally, list is where you need to write a series of events, actions, attributes, and so on that work together to explain or define something. It's vital to understand what these words are actually asking us to do in order for us to approach the assignment of a timed essay effectively. The most difficult part of a timed essay is the timing itself. Usually when we write, we have an almost unlimited amount of time, right? We have a research paper and we have weeks to do it. A timed essay, we have to sit down and write, complete, revise everything, all within a certain time frame. So when possible, always begin by answering questions that are worth the most points. You never know if you're going to get hung up on something and run out of time. So always focus and answer first, if possible, those questions that are worth the most points. If all you're doing is writing a single essay, then you need to divide your time for each step of the writing process. So if you have 30 minutes to write your essay, for example, spend 5 minutes pre-writing and outlining, 20 minutes drafting, and 5 minutes revising. Okay, so I always suggest make yourself go through the entire writing process, even in a timed essay. Depending on how much time you have and how much time you think it will take you to actually write the essay, allot the time accordingly. And plan that ahead of time, right? So if you know you have 50 minutes, Then think it out in your mind and plan how many minutes do I have for pre-writing, how many minutes to draft, and how many minutes to revise. Now on to the actual organization and writing of the essay. First, no matter how long the essay is, again, please spend a minute or two at least outlining your ideas. And when it comes to the writing, there are certain strategies to the writing that makes the whole process a lot easier. First is to write double-spaced so that you have room for later revisions if you need to add or delete something. Don't waste time trying to think of anything extra catchy. And unlike other essays, rather than writing a lengthy introduction, begin your essay with your thesis. Okay, lots of students waste a lot of time in the beginning trying to come up with a clever way of introducing the topic. With a timed essay, don't waste your time doing that. Begin your essay with your thesis. Make sure to avoid unnecessary information or details, right? So you have no time for filling in information that is unnecessary. Stick only to those direct necessary information and details that you need. Present your ideas directly and always give concrete evidence to support your ideas. Use examples and explanations and careful analysis. Don't restate or repeat your thesis over and over again throughout your essay. Instead, use your examples to show how your thesis is true. Remember that each paragraph should address one specific part of your thesis, and it's very important for a timed essay, just as it is in any writing, but especially for a timed essay, to use clear topic sentences to emphasize your main points. And remember, topic sentences are those first sentences of each of your paragraphs. So out of all of these little tips, I think the most important one, because it's different than other writing, is to begin with your thesis, and then to remember that you need to provide examples and explanations, but that those, as always, should never outweigh your own analysis. The biggest mistake I see in timed essays in my students' writing is that students suddenly forget that the more narrow their thesis is, the better, and students begin writing big general summaries of topics and themes rather than, like any other writing assignment, digging in deep into one narrow idea or topic or theme. So with your thesis statement stated right at the very beginning, make sure that it hits deep into a narrow topic within the broader assignment. Okay? That will be the biggest step to a really, really good timed essay. And finally, save yourself a couple of minutes to revise. And as always, go big and then small. So catch any inconsistencies in your argument. Find if there are areas that you should have given evidence, so the omissions of evidence or significant analysis. Remember that it's okay to cross out and rewrite and add sentences, even paragraphs, as long as you direct your reader accordingly. And you don't have to be super neat about it, right? You don't have to use whiteout. Simply scratch it out with your pen. And finally, check for minor mechanical errors. So at the very end, the last minute or two, quickly skim through for grammar, spelling, and punctuation mistakes. And last but not least, submit it and take a nice deep sigh of relief. And if you follow these tips and strategies, you prepare well by answering practice exam questions, by building practice outlines and thesis statements. If you begin with a very narrow and strong thesis statement rather than a lengthy introduction, if you focus and keep your paragraphs and topic sentences of your paragraphs directly related to your thesis, and if you give yourself time to work through each step of this writing process in the timed essay, you're going to do incredible. And I know that timed essays give students a lot of stress and anxiety, so if you have one coming up and have any questions or concerns, shoot me an email. We'll see if we can clear it up right away and get you ready. Now on to our final common college essay type, which is the personal essay. The purpose of a personal essay is to use a personal experience as a way to explore a certain theme or question. Okay, so the purpose of a personal essay is not to write an autobiography or to gush about how great you are as an individual. Rather, it's to use a specific experience from your life to explore a certain theme or question in a new and a personal way. The first key to a good personal essay is to choose a specific experience that you can examine in order to draw meaning from it. Okay, so don't just choose an experience that you thought was really fun or you liked and thought people might think it's interesting. Rather, choose one that you can examine and draw meaning from. To do that, you ask, so what? So what about this experience? Why is this experience significant to me personally? What other past experiences have I had that give significance and meaning to this specific experience? How does this experience answer deeper philosophical questions that need to be explored? What can this experience be compared to in order to add significance to it? And how did my own personality or feeling affect the experience? So if you can't come up with good answers to some of these questions, if not all of these questions, then it's time to reconsider the experience that you're choosing to write on. The personal essay, as with lots of our writing actually, needs to answer two things, the what and the so what. The what are the details of the experience itself, and the so what is that after each of these details you provide, you ask yourself, so what? Who cares? Why does this matter? And you answer this question by exploring different aspects with each detail that you provide about the experience. So you explore things like your thoughts and feelings during that experience or during that detail of the experience. The inner dialogue that you had, flashbacks, parallel stories, and interpretations. In other words, when you're assigned to write a personal essay, the goal is not for you to tell about an experience, just to tell about an experience. It's to dig into a deeper critical meaning of that experience. Okay? And that's what the so what is. Now, I'm not going to talk about how to write a personal essay specifically. You follow the same type of format as most of the writing we've done. So, a basic introduction and thesis, the body and conclusion, with topic sentences that relate back to your thesis. So believe it or not, a personal essay does still need to have a thesis. And that's where you answer the so what, right? This is my experience, and through this experience, I learned this. That's a thesis, right? A claim. This experience provides deeper insight into this, the topic. That's a thesis, okay? So it does still need a thesis, and it does still need topic sentences that refer back to the thesis. So rather than rehashing how to write an introduction, a thesis, a body, and a conclusion, I'm just going to give you some warnings today. I'm just going to give you some things to do and some things to avoid when writing a personal essay. And then you can send me any questions that you might have. First, never use general statements or cliches. For some reason, when we give students the assignment of writing a personal essay, students pick from a big assortment of cliches and use the same general statements. Don't do this. Instead, allow yourself to be creative and speak concretely and concisely. In other words, avoid being ambiguous. So don't guess that your reader knows what happened in an experience or automatically understands the deeper meanings of the details of your experience. Instead, like all your writing, whenever you give examples or details, provide lots of personal analysis. Something else is to avoid being preachy and to avoid always trying to provide and the moral of the story is, this is another very common mistake in student writing of personal essays, that we feel like it's a time to preach or to provide morals. That's not the goal of a personal essay. The goal of a personal essay, again, is to use a personal experience to dig deeper into a certain idea. Okay, so I hope this helps in preparation for your next personal essay that you'll have to write. As always, let me know if you have any questions. And as this is the final lecture of our Common College Essay Types series, let me know if you have any questions about any of the college essay types, or if you're struggling to prepare for one that you've recently been assigned. Let me know, and I'll see if I can give you a couple of tips on the spot and help you on your way. All right? Thanks, guys, and we'll see you next time for the beginning of our final section. Well, all right, welcome back. We're on to our final section of this course, pre-professional writing. Thank you all for sticking with me this long, and especially thank you to those of you that have reached out in our Facebook community and emailed me also with questions and concerns. As I explained in my introduction, my goal is not to simply provide you with all of this information about writing, but is to work with you as a mentor on your own writing and also to develop a community where we can discuss with others interested in improving their academic writing. our own questions and concerns and suggestions. So again, thank you to all of you that have been participating through the lectures and also outside of the lectures. I hope that you're finding this very helpful, and I really appreciate the feedback that I've already received, and hope that you also will spend the time to give me a review and some feedback so I can improve this course and other courses like it. But now we're moving outside of the academic sphere just for a moment, because although I like to dream that we go to university because we really want to learn and because we're curious and we're excited to explore new ideas, the reality is that most of us go to university with the final goal in mind of getting a job, right? So we need to do some type of professional writing practice in order to prepare for the writing that we have to do in order to secure a job at the end of our college experience. Or for those of us like me that have to work throughout the college experience to be able to find a job while going to school. So today, the first lecture on the pre-professional writing section is on resume writing. So the purpose of a resume is to show your qualifications to a prospective employer. It's also to display your unique qualifications and personality. Emphasis on the word unique or individual, right? And finally, it's to help you be invited for a job interview. And there's some key things that you can do to ensure that happens. The first is through your organization of your resume. We divided a resume into sections, and we do this under headings. Such headings include things like education, work experience, honors and awards, or volunteer activities. Depending on the specific job that you're applying for, and here is you need to do some personal research. You can also ask me questions if you'd like, and I'll try to address those. But specific jobs require other specific information. For example, I'm in the academia or in the academic world, and my jobs that I apply for need me to list my publications, as well as conference presentations and other professional activities that I've done. And depending on the type of job you're applying for, it's also important where you place these sections. For example, if I'm applying for a teaching job, then I'm going to put my teaching experience as one of the very top sections. Not at the very end or right in the middle, right? One of the very tops, because that's the emphasis. That's what I want my potential employer to read first. The next thing that's very important is the format. We need to use a readable format. So a readable format is vital. In order to create a readable format, don't use more than 2 typefaces. Okay? And those typefaces should be one uniform typeface for all of your headings, and then another uniform typeface for the body. A little note on which headings to choose. Make sure to use from the sans serif fonts for the headings. So things like Arial, and a serif font for the body, like Times New Roman. Also choose a font size that is very readable. So my suggestion is always use between 10 and 12 point font for the body. Headings can be larger. Don't make them overly large, but they should be a little bit larger, or can be a little bit larger than the body. Also remember not to rely heavily or too heavily on bold, italics, and bullet points. So if we have lots of different font sizes, font types, bolds, italics, bullet points, it gets very, very fragmented. So we need to keep a resume very simple and readable. Also, never decorate your resume. You'd be surprised how many people continue to do this. Never decorate your resume with clip art or other unnecessary decorations like borders and everything else we do to try to make documents look pretty. A resume does not need to look pretty through decorations. It needs to look pretty through having a very simple, readable organization and format, and through your own unique qualifications and personality. And a final tip, this is a really nitty-gritty one. For a hard copy that you turn in or submit to an employer, make sure to print it with a laser printer on bond paper. In other words, make sure that it looks very, very professional. Now on to the content. The first, of course, is very straightforward, but enough people leave it out that I find it necessary to repeat it here. That is, include your personal information. Include email address, a current one, if possible a professional one, for example, your university email address. You don't want an email address like sweetblondegirl27, right? That's not very professional. Use as professional of an email address as you have. also include your phone number, your physical address, and if you have a professional page, then go ahead and provide that URL link as well. Many professional organizations these days will look you up online anyway and see what type of online activity you're up to. So you might as well just provide it for them. On to your work experience. Rather than describing past jobs, for example, I was a secretary, and assuming that they know all of the things that you did or accomplished while you were in that position, your work experience or your description of your work experience should focus on quantifiable descriptions of successful achievements and transferable skills. I'll discuss that a little bit more here in just a second. While describing those skills, describe them very concisely, so don't get flowery and descriptive in your language. Describe them concisely and focus on your most impressive skills and achievements. Of course, they need to be accurate, so it's not a time for exaggeration. And they need to be written in an easy to understand style. And one of the most important strategies to make that easily to understand is to use descriptive verbs for each point and use numbers when you can rather than general descriptions. For example, rather than writing managed sales team, you could write increased team sales by 48% in 2013. So managed sales team is very general. No one really knows what you did as the manager of the sales team. But if you write with an active descriptive verb like increased, and then you use numbers, 48% in 2013, then your potential employer knows exactly what you were able to accomplish. And finally, let me give you some examples. I've also put the websites here where I took these from so that you can look them up, and there's descriptions and discussion of these examples and why they are good examples at these websites. So I don't need to talk you through them here, but I want you to be able to look at these to see how individual they can be. So the one on the left, through its organization and its formatting, is much different than the one on the right. They're very individual, but they include similar key characteristics. They're both very readable. They use uniform fonts for their headings and their body. You'll notice as you read through it as well that they use active descriptive verbs and numbers. Okay, so you can look this over after this lecture. After I finish the lecture, you can turn back and look through these examples, or simply click on these websites. These websites will also have links to other tools and suggestions and strategies for good resume writing. But I'd also be more than happy to look at your resume and give you a few tips on it if you want to send it my way. The next bit of pre-professional writing I'd like to discuss with you is graduate school admission essays. So for those of you that decide you'd like to continue in school rather than jumping straight into the workforce, this essay is absolutely critical, and writing it well could determine whether or not you get into a graduate school of your choice. The purpose of a graduate school admissions essay is first to set you apart from all of the other candidates. Remember, all of these candidates are going to have impressive test scores, great grades on their transcripts, and most likely really positive letters of recommendation. In other words, no matter where you apply for graduate school, it is very likely that the pool of applicants will have similar academic achievements. And this admissions essay is the first thing that's going to set you apart. Most graduate departments agree that the graduate school admissions essay is often the deciding factor in your admission. And two of the things that are most deciding about your essay is how it demonstrates your knowledge of the program you're applying to, and in what ways you highlight experiences that demonstrate your accomplishments and qualifications. So let's talk first about how to prepare to write an effective graduate school admissions essay. First, you need to read about the school's program description, mission statement, and the professor's specialties within the program. After researching your program, you need to ask yourself, what makes me a good fit for this program? Or which experiences and qualities best illustrate how I can contribute to the program? The more specific and in detail you can speak to the program itself and how you fit into this program, the better. Remember also that just like any other writing assignment, you need to outline. Okay, so these two questions that I just asked are your pre-writing. Free write, idea map, do whatever you need to do to pre-write and then begin to outline them. And then let's go on to the drafting stage. In your introduction, you need to describe what you want to study, why you want to study it, and why the chosen school is a good fit. And you do this by identifying specific aspects of the program. For example, specific professors you would like to work with and why. It's so important to avoid general statements, unessential information, and cliches. For example, for as long as I can remember, I've wanted to be a doctor. So has everyone else that's applying to medical school, right? So just avoid all of those types of general statements and information and cliches. Instead, let your own personality, in a very professional way, show through your writing. One of the most important parts of your essay is deciding which experiences to use. So if you remember, just a few lectures back we talked about personal essays and how important it is to choose an experience that you can dig deeper into in order to derive some type of meaning out of that experience. The same can be said in choosing which experiences to highlight in your admissions essay. But it's also important to know how to incorporate those experiences. So the first way is to know how to transition quickly and clearly from your introduction into your experiences. Here's an example. One opportunity that prepared me for the medical program at Harvard is, and then you describe the opportunity. So the thesis of your graduate school admissions essay is simply where you want to study, why you want to study there, right? And then the transition is to jump straight into those opportunities and experiences that highlight why you are a good fit. When it comes to the number of experiences, it's also best to be narrow and specific rather than listing a bunch of achievements and a bunch of experiences. So describe one or two experiences, usually no more than two, that clearly illustrate some of the qualities you already identified. For example, your intellectual curiosity or your commitment. While you do this, be concise, specific, and focus on highlighting your own qualities more than narrating the story. So in other words, discuss what you learned, how you grew, how this has shaped who you've become, and the qualities that you now possess, rather than focusing on the story itself. Remember though, however, when you do this, and you're focusing on your own qualifications, your growth and your development, never exaggerate or embellish the facts. It's the worst thing you can do. Don't exaggerate. Instead, choose experience, like research or work, internships, and so on, that demonstrate your knowledge of and interaction with the current field you want to study, and then use those to demonstrate or to highlight the individual qualities that you possess in order to be a good fit within that current field and within that specific program. Finally, move on to the conclusion, where it is okay to assert yourself as a qualified candidate based on the experiences that you've shared. In other words, my experiences in geological research and fieldwork make me a capable candidate for your geology program. Okay, so you don't need to beat around the bush in this section. It's time to assert yourself based on the discussion that you've just provided in the body as a capable candidate for whatever graduate program you're applying for. And then, like everything else when it comes to writing, you need to revise. This is so important. This needs to be one of the best pieces of writing you've ever done. One of the cleanest, most error-free pieces of writing you've ever done. So follow the steps that we've already talked about over and over again. Check for the overall unity, the unity of body paragraphs, the effectiveness of each paragraph, the correct use of citations, if you've included any, sentence style, sentence level, word choice, spelling, and finally, spell check. But my biggest piece of advice is to ask one, or in best cases, multiple trusted professors to read it and to give you feedback. Most of them would usually also be happy to read multiple versions. So get the best draft you possibly can, revise it yourself, and then ask some trusted professors to read it and to give you some feedback. and then revise it again and ask them to give you a final read. Okay? And then revise it again, depending on their final comments, before you submit it. Remember to also do things like reading it aloud, reading it in different formats, paper and digital. Everything you have to do in order to make sure that this is the best and most solid and clean piece of writing you've done. And if you need some extra eyes, send it on my way, and I'll give you some feedback as well. All right, so you've put together a very professional looking resume that highlights your unique qualifications and personality that make you the perfect fit for your dream job. Now there's one more step before submitting that resume, and that is to write your cover letter. Today we're going to talk about cover letters and follow-up letters. And the purpose of these letters is to help you be invited for a job interview. So before composing your cover letter, make sure to research the company and the specific job you're applying for. Familiarize yourself with the recommended qualifications and job requirements, and make sure to balance your qualifications with your own willingness and ability to learn from your new employer and job. In other words, no one wants to hire someone who lacks the humility of learning and adapting to a new job environment. Okay? So although we're wanting to highlight our qualifications in our cover letter, we also need to highlight our willingness to learn and to adapt. This is also a time to let your personality shine. So no one else's personality, especially some boring cover letter template that you downloaded from the internet, take the place of your unique personality. To do this, avoid using general statements and cliches that the internet and downloaded templates usually promote. At the same time, however, never flatter yourself or your potential employer. Okay, so don't puff yourself up and exaggerate, and don't praise your potential employer so much that it turns into flattery. No one wants that. Finally, revise your letter until it is absolutely error-free. So let's talk about what to include in a cover letter. The first is the opening paragraph, where you need to address why you are writing, what position you are applying for, how you heard about the opening, and if someone in good standing with the company suggested that you apply, it's a good time to mention that person's name. Then you move on to the middle paragraph or paragraphs. Here you address why you are interested in working for this employer and this type of work, and you point out particular achievements that you will expound upon in your resume. So it's not a time to repeat everything that your resume is going to state. It's a time to highlight the specific achievements, the specific skills, and your resume is there to provide more detail. And then we move on to the closing paragraph, where you provide your phone number, state that you are available to meet at their convenience, so at your potential employer's convenience, and directly ask in a kind way for an interview. So let's look at the actual format. You should follow the standard cover letter format. Here I've laid out the kind of the personal information section of the cover letter at the top of your cover letter. I won't go through that though. Instead, I'll just provide you with an example cover letter. Like the example resumes I've given you, I'm not going to walk you through this. You can read this and come back to this and read this. I just want you to see the format. So we have your personal information at the very top, the date, your potential employer's information, and then you get into the letter. You have the first paragraph addressing why you're writing, what position, how you heard from it, and mentioning anyone's name who suggested you apply, only if they're in good standing with the company, of course. We move into the body paragraph or paragraphs, where we highlight only those specific achievements or skills that are pertinent to the specific job. We give our phone number, our contact information, state our availability at their convenience, and then ask for an interview. And because you did all of this so well, you've submitted your resume with a stellar cover letter, you receive an interview. You go to the interview, have a great discussion, things look promising. You're not done yet. You need to write a follow-up letter. And this is what to include. So the template is the same as before, same as the cover letter, but you include a few different things. First, in the opening paragraph, you thank the potential employer for the interview. expressing the appreciation for the consideration that the employer is giving you. You remind the employer about the position you interviewed for, as well as the date and place of the interview. In the middle paragraph, you restate your interest in the position and company. And if you've done anything since the interview, for example, you've researched the company or spoken with other employees and so on, it's a good time to mention it here in the middle paragraph. And then you express your willingness to provide any additional information that the employer might need. Finally, in the closing paragraph, you suggest further action, such as your availability to meet again at the employer's convenience. And then you send it off and hope that with this follow-up letter, you'll hear back soon with an exciting offer. Like always, send on any cover letters to me that you'd like me to have a look at. I'll give you a brief look and some feedback and wish you the best.